Before the city of Florence stretches fully into its day, before the bells begin their soft echo from across the Arno, before the market carts creak across the cobblestones, and children dart through narrow alleys with loaves of bread in tow, the shoemaker sits alone in the dim hush of his workshop, surrounded by tools and silence, and the scent of oiled leather still clings faintly to the wooden walls from the night before, mixing with the earthy dampness of old stone and soot, and he doesn't light a candle at first, preferring the dusky gray of dawn slipping through the high windows, casting long, quiet shadows across the shelves and workbenches, illuminating only what's needed and leaving the rest in a kind of gentle pause. He pours a small cup of yesterday's wine from a clay jug, not to drink it right away, but to hold it in his palm as warmth returns to his fingers, as if the cup itself were part of a morning ritual that no longer needs to be explained. And nearby, arranged not with ceremony, but with habit, the wooden forms, the stacks of stiff rawhide, the coils of sinew thread and curved awls lie in stillness, each resting in the exact place he left them, ready not to dazzle or surprise, but to begin again. And this time before, the day belongs to him alone, a sacred stillness before the first knock on the door, before the apprentice arrives, yawning and stretching and tracking in street dust, before the bustle and chatter of patrons inspecting heelwork and arguing about price. In this hour, the shoemaker hears everything: the shifting of the wooden beams overhead, the distant bark of a dog echoing through the quarter, the ticking of his own joints as he slowly lowers himself onto the stool near the stitching frame. And there, before touching a single tool, he stares at the half-finished shoe he left last night, the curve of the leather just beginning to rise into form, the thread paused mid-stitch, waiting like a sentence left open at the edge of sleep. And he runs his thumb along the edge not to measure, but to remember the softness of calfskin from a merchant's cart in Siena, the way the grain shifts ever so slightly between finger and light, and for a few breaths he simply sits, listening not to the world, but to the texture of things, the creak of old wood, the faint snap of a drying strip of hide, the weight of his apron against his knees. And this is the part of the day no one sees, no customer imagines, no ledger records, the slow, silent pact between hand and craft before the day demands anything more. And when he finally picks up the needle, threading it with practiced fingers through the eye, he doesn't hurry. There's no need. The city will wake in its own time. The streets will fill and empty again. The bells will ring and fade. But this moment is his, the beginning, beneath the beginning, where the day does not announce itself, but stretches gently like a shoe in warm hands, ready to shape, but not rushed, never rushed, only prepared to begin again. By the time the shoemaker has completed his third careful stitch of the morning, the sunlight has begun its gradual stretch across the uneven stone floor, reaching just far enough to illuminate the pair of shoes he set aside the day before, resting side by side on a cloth-draped bench like two resting travelers, their soles unfinished, the leather uppers shaped but not yet softened, stitched but not yet dyed, a pair ordered by a baker's assistant who paid in advance with coins that still carried the faint scent of flour. And as the shoemaker lifts one of the shoes into his lap, He examines it with the kind of attention not born of worry, but of knowing that each small imperfection carries the story of a process, a moment when the leather curled more than expected, or a line of thread caught ever so slightly on a dry patch, and he turns it gently in his hands, his fingers finding the rhythm that his eyes don't need to guide, pressing here, smoothing there, applying just enough pressure to coax the form from firmness to flow, and then, reaching for the burnishing tool, he begins to rub the edge of the sole in small circular motions, letting the warmth of friction and time soften the leather's border until it feels less like something that was cut and more like something that always belonged to that shape. And in this motion, repeated 1,000 times over years of quiet work, there is no rush, no ambition, only the slow partnership between material and hand, between what is given and what is drawn out, and above the shoemaker, the rafters creak faintly with the expansion of wood in the growing warmth, while outside, a wheel turns on cobblestone, a chicken squawks, and the faint sound of a broom sweeping across a stone doorstep gives rhythm to the neighborhood's slow stirring. But inside, the only sound is the steady rub of tool on leather, the occasional exhale through the nose, and the whisper of thread sliding through a practiced hole. The shoemaker pauses only once, not out of fatigue, but to sip from the cup beside him, the wine now warmed slightly by proximity to the morning sun. He sets it down again without glancing and resumes, the upper portion of the shoe now firming into its final form, shaped over the wooden last with silent precision. And there is no moment of triumph, no signal that something has been achieved, because in his mind the work is not a task, but a passage, each pair a continuation of the last, each customer a brief echo in a story that has no need for grandeur. And when he finishes the first of the pair and sets it beside its mate once more, he does so not with pride or satisfaction, but with calm, as if placing a stone back into a stream where it always belonged. And as the city begins to swell with life beyond the window, carts rolling, doors opening, voices rising, the shoemaker stays within the gentle envelope of his work, touching, adjusting, and beginning again, because there is always another pair to tend to, another seam to close, another sole to smooth, and none of it needs to be hurried. Not here, not in this quiet shop beneath the eaves of Florence, where time passes by the turn of a tool and the settling of a stitch. The soft clang of the bell above the door is gentle, almost apologetic, as it rings out across the quiet shop, its sound lingering a moment in the rafters before dissolving into the steady hush of mid-morning, and the shoemaker, without looking up from his stitching, knows precisely who has entered, not from the sound of the bell alone, but from the rhythm of the steps that follow, quick, nervous, slightly uneven, the pattern of someone trying to appear unhurried while still hoping not to be noticed. And sure enough, the apprentice stands just inside the doorway, cheeks flushed, cap in his hand, breathing a little too fast, and already beginning to explain, though the shoemaker raises one hand, not in anger, but simply to wave away the need for words, for he has heard every version of every excuse already. The cart was late, The river crossing was blocked. The baker gave him an extra loaf to carry. His mother needed water drawn, and the shoemaker does not scold, for he remembers what it was like to be young in a city that pulled you in 10 directions before breakfast. So he gestures slowly toward the rear workbench, where a pair of worn soles waits to be scraped clean and prepped for reapplication, and the apprentice, eager to redeem the lost time, sets down his satchel, rolls up his sleeves, and begins, and the sound of his tools joins the quiet symphony of the shop, the scrape of blade against cork, the whisper of twine being measured against the stretch of an arm, the faint creak of the stool beneath shifting weight, and after a while, the shoemaker speaks, not with instruction, but with observation, commenting on the weather, on the way the sun has been hotter this spring than the last, on how the alder tree across the square seems to be dropping its leaves too early, and the apprentice, unsure at first whether this is part of a lesson, replies cautiously, offering his own opinions in halting phrases, his hands never stopping their motion. And together, the two continue like this, their conversation a quiet current beneath the louder sounds of craft. And though the apprentice occasionally glances toward the clock mounted high on the wall, where the shadow of the hour hand creeps slowly past the carved, the shoemaker never does, his sense of time shaped not by gears or bells, but by the texture of the work itself. And eventually, the apprentice settles, his nervous energy dissolving into the rhythm of repetition, the gentle satisfaction of shaving, sanding, applying adhesive, pressing pieces together, and watching form emerge from effort. And at one point, he drops a tool, a small awl that clatters against the stone floor, and he freezes, waiting for reprimand. But the shoemaker merely looks up, raises one brow, and says nothing, and the silence that follows is not tense, but instructive, a reminder that the work, like the city outside, will continue with or without perfection. And as the morning stretches on, and the sunlight creeps higher across the floor, casting the shape of the window lattice in angled gold across the shoes lined neatly on the drying rack, the apprentice's motions begin to match the shoemaker's, slower, steadier, less urgent, until the workshop, once divided by nervousness and calm, now hums with quiet unity, the work passing from hand to hand like a folded piece of cloth being smoothed across a table, each crease disappearing into the hole. Late in the morning, just as the air in the shop thickened slightly, with the warmth rising through the stones of the street outside, and the faint hum of city life beyond the door settles into a quiet drone. Carts rolling past, voices echoing off the stucco walls, the metallic ring of a far-off hammer from some unknown forge. The shoemaker hears the soft, shuffling approach of a customer long before the latch turns, and without pausing his stitching, he calls gently for the apprentice to open the door, which creaks only slightly as it gives way to the light, allowing in the figure of an older woman, wrapped in shawls even though the sun is bright, her feet wrapped in layers of cloth beneath cracked shoes that have seen more years than most of the city's tiled rooftops, and she enters slowly, cautiously, each step accompanied by a slight wince, though she says nothing of her pain, instead offering a polite nod and carefully unfolding a worn piece of parchment from her sleeve. The edges curled and faded, its content half legible, but enough to show that someone, likely her grandson, has written instructions for a repair, and the shoemaker, still seated, gestures for her to sit on the low stool near the window, while he motions for the apprentice to fetch water, not for tea, but simply to soak a cloth. And then he sets aside his own work, wipes his hands on the apron tied around his waist, and kneels not with speed, but with the slow respect reserved for both craft and age, reaching out gently to help her untie the cloth bindings, and as he peels them back, revealing the soft, swollen skin beneath, the cracked edges of the leather give way like bark from an old tree, and he does not comment on the state of the shoes. There is no judgment here, only quiet assessment, noting the uneven wear along the outer heel, the stitching at the toe that has come loose, the faint scent of dust and lavender that clings to the lining, and as he turns the shoe in his hands, the woman begins to speak in a soft voice, recounting not complaints, but stories, how she wore these shoes when walking to market the day her daughter was born, how the leather stretched too tightly that first winter, but softened by spring, how she always meant to replace them, but other things, always more pressing, always came first, and the shoemaker listens, not with surprise, but with a kind of inward nodding, for he has heard such stories before, and he knows that shoes are not just garments, but quiet witnesses to weather, to waiting, to weddings, to losses. And when the apprentice returns with the damp cloth, the shoemaker wraps it around the woman's feet with careful precision, not to heal, but to comfort, to cool the ache that time has written. And then he promises simply to do what he can, not with grand assurances, but with a confidence that lives not in words, but in hands. And she thanks him with a look that holds no expectation, only relief as she slowly rises and prepares to leave, the parchment folded again, her steps no lighter, but somehow less burdened. And as the door clicks shut behind her, and the bell overhead offers its quiet chime once more, the shoemaker holds the worn shoes for a moment longer in his palms before setting them gently on the bench, ready not just to repair, but to preserve what remains, not just the shape, but the memory woven into every crease, every faded seam in the back corner of the workshop, where the light from the street windows fades into a cool shadow, and the smell of leather is replaced by a more earthy, alchemical scent, a mix of iron-rich water, fermented bark, and dried marigold petals, sits the dyeing table, an uneven slab of wood stained in overlapping rings, and spills from years of patient work, not messy, but lived in, like the hands of a gardener, or the surface of an old kitchen hearth. And here the shoemaker now stands, sleeves pushed up, apron streaked, holding in one hand a pair of shoes shaped, but still pale, raw like dough before baking, while in the other hand he swirls a long-handled brush in a small clay bowl filled with a deep brown dye that has been steeping since before sunrise, a mixture prepared from a crushed walnut husks, ash water, and a few drops of linseed oil, stirred in a clockwise motion, as if direction held meaning, as if the dye would bloom richer if guided gently by the hand. And when he finally lifts the brush, and brings it to the leather, he does not apply it in bold strokes, but in slow, circular motions, letting the color seep rather than sit, watching as the surface darkens in gradual waves, the pale yellow of the untreated hide drinking in the liquid and turning warm, then warm brown, then a deeper chestnut, like wood polished by years of sun and use. And the shoemaker does not rush this task, for dyeing is not just about color, but about time, and the leather must accept the dye, like the skin accepts the sun, not all at once, but over long, patient minutes. And he leans slightly over the table as he works, the smell of the dye close and familiar, the edge of the brush handle resting lightly between his fingers, his other hand gently rotating the shoe so the grain catches the light, the creases forming and relaxing in quiet rhythm. And in the stillness of this part of the shop, the city beyond the walls seems far away, the clatter and song of Florence, muffled as if wrapped in cloth, replaced by the tiny sounds of transformation, the gentle brush swish, the occasional drip falling from the bowl's lip onto the worn surface of the table, the slow exhale from the shoemaker's nose as he shifts his weight. And it is here, more than anywhere else in the workshop, that he feels closest to the moment when material becomes something more, not finished, not new, but transformed, made ready to meet the world in its own quiet way. And he knows, as he always does, that this stage cannot be rushed, that each layer of dye must dry before the next is applied, and that to force the process would mean cracks, peels, weakness. So he sets the first shoe aside once the coat is finished, its surface gleaming in places, matte in others, waiting like a story with its ink still drying, and begins the second shoe with the same care, never measuring time with a clock, but with the way the light changes on the leather. And when both are complete, he lifts the bowl and pours the last of the dye back into its small storage jar, corking it tight, wiping the rim, placing it back onto the shelf, alongside jars of ochre, rust, umber, and faded blue, each one a note in a symphony of possibility, each waiting not just for a shoemaker, but for the patience to listen. And as the dyed shoes rest on a rack near the window, absorbing the light of early afternoon, they begin to take on their true shape, not just of foot and form, but of craft and care, of time invested without urgency, of something made slowly and therefore made well. Against the side wall of the workshop, tucked beneath a shelving unit crowded with folded hides and boxes of metal buckles, sits an old wooden drawer chest, narrow and tall, with 16 tiny drawers stacked like silent chapters in a book no one reads aloud. And though its surface is scratched and its brass knobs slightly tarnished, the shoemaker treats it with quiet reverence, for inside each drawer lies a specific kind of shoelace, coiled like sleeping worms, some wrapped around scraps of parchment, others knotted gently to keep their memory of use, thin leather thongs for sandals, braided hemp cords for workmen's boots, silken strands dyed black for morning shoes, and thick, waxed string favored by those who walk long roads and do not wish to stop often. And once a week, usually on a day when the city outside feels too loud or too hurried, the shoemaker takes a moment, not scheduled, not required, to tend to the laces, a task as much about rhythm as it is about utility. And today is such a day, the sort of afternoon where sunlight trickles in through the upper windows in long, slanted beams that cut across the dust motes like threads of gold, and the noise from the streets below floats upward like faraway music. A violin played in an open window, a woman's voice calling to her child, the soft clang of pots being scrubbed. And here, amid this quiet backdrop, the shoemaker kneels before the drawer chest and begins, opening each drawer with slow fingers, taking out each lace one by one, running it between thumb and forefinger to feel for frays or knots, then laying it out on the table in gentle rows. And as he works, his mind wanders not forward but backward, drifting to memories, not of shoes, but of moments. The merchant from Venice, who insisted on emerald green laces, no matter the shoe. The apprentice's first attempt at braiding a lace that turned out crooked but strong. The quiet widow who brought her husband's boots to be restrung a week after his passing, asking only that the knots be tight. And in this drawer, these cords, there is more than function. There is sentiment, the invisible record of choices made and lives stepped through. And as he sorts and polishes, tying small bundles and sliding them gently back into their places, he listens to the creak of the drawers, the whisper of lace sliding across worn wood, the occasional sigh that escapes his own chest without effort or purpose. And when the last drawer is closed, the laces sorted and the table cleared again, the shoemaker sits back for a moment, wiping his hands on a cloth that smells faintly of wax and cedar, then glances toward the drying shoes on the rack, as if reassured that the work continues, even in stillness, because sometimes it is not the cutting, stitching, or dyeing that defines the craft, but the care taken with what holds things together. And as the sunlight begins to shift, drawing the day a little closer to its end, the drawer chest returns to silence, its contents organized not just by type or color, but by memory and touch, waiting quietly to be called upon once more. The window at the far end of the workshop, the one that faces a narrow alley just wide enough to let in a slice of afternoon light, serves no grand purpose. It is not used for display, and no customer ever stands beside it. But the shoemaker often finds his gaze drifting there in moments between tasks, especially in the quiet lull after midday, when the warmth has fully settled into the stones of the floor and the sounds of the street feel more distant, more wrapped in cotton. And on the ledge of that window, where a slight dip in the sill collects dust and stray bits of string, there often rests a pigeon, the same one or one exactly like it, mottled gray and soft-bodied, with a little limp in its step, and a habit of staring inward through the glass with a kind of quiet patience, as if it, too, were waiting for something to be finished. And the shoemaker never shoos it away, not even when it leaves faint white traces or sheds a feather that drifts slowly down into the workshop like a fragile idea. For he has come to think of the bird as a kind of neighbor, an observer of the slow craft that fills the room. And sometimes, when he takes his bread at lunch and slices off a small corner to dip into oil, he sets aside a bit to place later on the outside sill, not as a reward, but as a ritual, something offered in exchange for the bird's companionship, however silent and unacknowledged. And on this afternoon, as the shoemaker sands the edge of a thick heel, the rhythmic rasp of tool against sole, keeping quiet time, he glances toward the window and sees the pigeon once again, its body half in shadow, its eye reflecting a glint of the sun. And, for a moment, the shoemaker stops working, not because he is tired, but because the light and the stillness have aligned just so, and it feels like a moment that requires nothing more than to be noticed. And he thinks, though he doesn't say it aloud, that perhaps this pigeon has watched more shoes be made than some of his customers have ever worn. And there is something comforting in that, in the idea that even in a world that values motion and noise and bustle, there is space for this, for a bird to perch in quiet repetition, for a man to work with his hands and speak to no one, for both to exist together without purpose beyond the day itself. And after a while, the pigeon hops twice, turns, and flies off down the alley, its wings brushing the stone walls with a sound like fabric being folded, and the shoemaker returns to his task without sigh or remark, the rasp of the sanding tool continuing exactly where it left off, but now accompanied by a thin beam of sunlight slipping through the place where the pigeon once sat, falling across the table like a slow-moving hand, illuminating the dust in the air, the grain of the leather, and the quiet perseverance of the man who will sit here until the work tells him it's time to stop. The floor beneath the shoemaker's feet is made of thick wooden planks, laid down long before he came to this place, their surfaces worn smooth by the passing of countless souls, not only shoes, but bare feet in the summer, apprentices rushing to fetch glue, merchants pacing with impatient steps, and even the soft tread of the shoemaker himself, always moving with deliberate slowness. And these boards, though scuffed and faded, have learned the music of the workshop, the rhythmic creak beneath the stool when he leans forward to inspect a seam, the brief crackle when a shaving of leather is swept aside, the hollow echo when someone walks too quickly as across the room, revealing a loose nail or a hollow knot beneath. And though no one else listens, the shoemaker hears these notes each day as clearly as a tune, not just sounds, but signs, reminders that the building breathes with the work, that time has weight, that memory can be stored in wood, and there is a particular spot, just in front of the workbench nearest the window, where the boards give slightly, a dip barely noticeable, but felt every time he steps there, as if the floor itself were sighing under his weight, not in protest but in familiarity. And on days when the air is especially still and the tools rest in their racks, he sometimes walks the length of the workshop without speaking, his footsteps slow and spaced, listening to the way the boards respond, the rise and fall of tones, too subtle for anyone in a hurry to notice. And he recalls, as he often does, the first time he entered this space as a boy, led by the hand of his uncle, who had run the shop before him, and how he had marveled, not at the shoes or the tools, but at the way the floor felt alive, how each creak beneath his feet made him feel like he was stepping into a story that was already being told. And now, years later, he understands that story better, not one of events or milestones, but of repetition, of slow making and stillness, of hundreds of ordinary days stitched together like the soul to the upper, forming something stronger than it appears. And as the day stretches on and the sun tilts lower in the sky, casting its last golden edge across the floor, the shoemaker pauses once more, resting a worn heel on that familiar dip in the wood, feeling it yield just enough to greet him. And for a moment, he imagines that the boards beneath him are whispering in their own language, not words, but vibrations, telling him gently that what he's doing matters, not because it's grand, but because it is done with care, again and again, in the same quiet way. And he nods once to no one, steps back to his stool, and continues the careful stitching of a child's first walking shoe, the floor creaking beneath him with a slow, approving groan. It begins with the selection, the shoemaker standing before the spool rack, where lines of thread hang like strands of forgotten music, some bleached white like untouched linen, others darkened to the color of river mud or roasted chestnut, each one chosen not for beauty, but for how it holds. And today, he selects a mid-weight flaxen cord, stiff at first touch, but softened with beeswax, rubbed slowly between thumb and palm. A ritual he performs with such consistency that the waxed cloths used for this purpose hold the shape of his fingers like pressed leaves in an old book. And once the thread is prepared, he cuts it to length, not by measuring but by feeling, stretching it arm's width twice over, a length that matches the pace of his stitching, long enough to close the seam without stopping, but not so long that it will catch or tangle. And then comes the needle, curved ever so slightly at the tip, its eye just large enough to accept the thread without fraying it. He threads it smoothly, pulling it through and doubling back the tail, which he tugs once, tight and final. A knot formed not by tying, but by tension and confidence. And then he settles into his stool once more, the leather piece laid flat before him like a map yet to be marked, the pre-punched holes in a perfect arc awaiting their purpose, and the needle enters the first hole with a faint hiss, like breath drawn through teeth, the thread pulled taut behind it, and then again, in and out, a motion repeated hundreds of times over a single afternoon, so familiar that the shoemaker no longer watches his hands, but listens instead to the texture of each pull, the slight resistance, the soft squeak of waxed fiber against dried hide, the gentle knock of his finger ring tapping the workbench edge every third stitch. And this is a rhythm, not taught, but absorbed, the kind of knowledge that lives in the muscles of the hand and the bend of the spine, not in books. And as he works, the room around him fades into the periphery, the dust drifting through sunbeams, the slow movement of the shadow across the wall, the low murmur of the apprentice sweeping the back. All of it becomes a kind of backdrop to the only thing that matters now, the journey of the thread from one side of the leather to the other and back again, each pass binding not just the material, but the moment. And sometimes he imagines the thread has memory, that it knows the shape it's meant to form, and he is merely following its will, guiding it not as a master, but as a companion. And when the last stitch is made, and the thread trimmed flush to the leather, the seam lies smooth and tight, not just joined, but at rest, and the shoemaker runs his hand along it once, gently as if smoothing the edge of a sleeping child's blanket, and then sets the piece aside, not hurriedly, but with care, as though it were a page finished in a long, slow letter, ready to dry, to be shaped, to become something more. And with that, he leans back, rubs the wax from his fingers, with a cloth already stained with a dozen days of work, and reaches once more for the spool rack, where the next thread waits in silence when the church bell rings out once, twice, and then a long third note that seems to settle itself into the very beams of the ceiling. The shoemaker knows it is midday, not because he counts the hours, but because the rhythm of the morning has reached its natural pause, and with slow, deliberate motion, he lays down his awl beside the half-bound sandal, brushes the small leather shavings off the bench, and rises from his stool, his knees creaking softly like old hinges as he moves toward the far table, a table not used for work, but reserved for the daily ritual of bread and rest. And on this table, lit by a warm square of sunlight from the upper window, sits a modest cloth bundle brought from home at dawn, wrapped in linen, tied with string, holding a heel of coarse bread, a small round of sheep's cheese, a few olives, and a clay flask of watered wine. Not a feast, but not meager either, simply enough, as always, to nourish and to mark the passing of another half-day of quiet effort. And he unfolds the cloth slowly, smoothing the wrinkles, as if each motion were part of a longer story passed down through hands and habit. And then he breaks the bread with fingers that have held awls, needles, and shears all morning, the rough crust crackling under pressure, the inner crumb still soft from the baking heat of 2 days before, and he eats in silence, chewing slowly, each bite filling the small room with a sense of peace that no words could improve. And beside him, the apprentice eats too, perched on a low stool, unwrapping his own bundle in quick, uncoordinated gestures. Sometimes they speak during lunch, but not always. And today they do not. Today, the silence is companionable, broken only by the faint sound of cheese being sliced with a pocket blade, the rustle of the linen napkin, and the faint swallow of watered wine. And the shoemaker, between bites, gazes at the rows of shoes lined up to dry, the ones he has already stitched, dyed, and pressed, and feels the quiet satisfaction not of completion, but of continuity, of being mid-journey, mid-process, with more to do but nothing to chase. And after the food is finished, he leans back slightly in his chair, not to sleep, but to breathe, eyes half closed, the wine warming his chest, his mind tracing invisible lines through the rafters. And he listens to the faint coo of a pigeon returning to its perch, the soft clink of the apprentice's flask being corked, the barely audible flutter of a parchment shifting in the breeze from the window, and then, as naturally as water returning to a still bowl, he rises again, brushes the crumbs from his lap into his palm, tosses them gently into the waste bin, and reties the linen cloth, folding it once, then again, before placing it back in its drawer. And when he returns to the workbench, The light has shifted slightly, casting a new shadow across the surface, as if inviting him to begin again. And he does, not with urgency, but with the ease of someone who understands that the hours, like the thread, are meant to be drawn slowly, stitch by stitch, day by day, along the back wall of the workshop, beneath the shelves of sorted leather, and behind the standing rack of finished shoes, sits a low wooden chest with a slightly bowed lid and hinges that creak softly in protest when opened, not because they are rusted, but because they are old, and like many things in the shoemaker's world, they speak slowly, responding to time and touch with resistance that feels more like memory than malfunction. And inside this chest, nested within a series of hand-carved compartments and cushioned with scraps of worn felt, lie the brass tools, polished not by cloth, but by years of holding, working, warming beneath the shoemaker's fingers. A burnisher with a handle smoothed by countless rotations, its wheel still bearing the faintest edge of golden polish. A crimping iron whose rounded teeth have pressed countless ridges into soft leather tongues. A tack puller shaped like a curled fishhook, worn thin at the tip, but still precise in its intent. And each of these tools, unlike the more frequently used blades and needles kept at arm's reach, is reserved for particular moments, not rare exactly, but purposeful, used when a certain kind of fold is required, or a seam must be coaxed into submission rather than forced. And today, as the sun hovers just past its apex, pouring down through the upper window in bright, honeyed shafts that catch dust like falling threads, the shoemaker kneels beside the chest and lifts the lid, not hurriedly, but as if greeting a long-absent friend, pausing for a moment to run his hand along the edge before selecting a tool. The curved creaser, shaped like a tiny plow, which he sets gently onto a clean cloth beside his bench, and then another, the brass hole punch, heavy for its size, its edge sharp enough to hum when pressed against a fingertip, and he arranges them not for display, but for readiness, each one aligned in silent agreement with the task ahead. And as he prepares a fresh piece of leather, thick and dark, destined to become the upper for a merchant's boot, he uses the creaser first, drawing along the edge in a smooth arc, not cutting, but pressing, leaving behind a fine groove like a path in soft earth, guiding where the stitches will soon go. And then, with the punch, he creates small, perfect holes in a line so straight it needs no ruler. The sound of each press a quiet thud, followed by a high, ringing snap as the brass releases. And between each action, he pauses to breathe, to look, to adjust, not because he doubts, but because he honors the process. And when the task is done, he sets the tools aside, wipes them carefully, and returns them to their felt-lined homes, closing the chest with both hands and letting the lid settle slowly, the air puffing out with a soft sigh. And in that moment, surrounded by the scent of polished brass, warm wood, and oiled leather, the shoemaker feels not accomplishment, but alignment, as if the rhythm of his day and the tools of his trade have moved together like gears in an old, well-kept clock, steady and sure, ticking forward without rush, just as they always have. As the sun begins, its slow descent past the tiled rooftops of Florence, casting long, golden rectangles of light across the uneven floor of the workshop, the shoemaker turns his attention to the wax pot, a squat, blackened vessel set upon a small iron stand near the hearth. Its surface bubbled and speckled from years of slow heating, of soft melting and careful application, and although no fire burns now, the residual warmth of the day has kept the pot pliable, its contents thick but stirrable, ready for use without fuss. And he lifts the lid slowly, inhaling the heavy, familiar scent of beeswax mingled with pine resin, tallow, and the faintest echo of lavender, the blend prepared long ago to preserve leather, protect seams, and keep moisture from finding its way into shoes that might walk through puddles, mud, or the spilled wash water of narrow alleyways. And with a small wooden paddle, carved by his grandfather, its handle smoothed by 3 generations of use, he stirs the mixture gently, watching the glossy swirl form a lazy spiral at the center, the color shifting from deep amber to pale gold depending on the light. And this task, like so many others, in the workshop, is never urgent, never loud, but carries with it the weight of consistency, a tradition not enforced, but followed like the slow pull of a tide. And after a few moments, satisfied with the texture, he dips a clean rag into the pot, just enough to catch a thin coat, and walks it back to the bench, where a pair of nearly finished shoes, elegant, low-cut, with a soft curl at the toe, await their final seal. And as he rubs the wax into the leather with slow, overlapping circles, the smell blooms into the room, settling over the surfaces like a warm blanket, calming even the restless stirring of the pigeons on the sill. And in this moment, time does not seem to pass in the way that it does in the street outside, where wheels clatter and voices rise, but instead thickens, softens, becomes syrupy and slow, measured only by the subtle darkening of the shoe's surface as it absorbs the wax and begins to shine, not brightly, but with a kind of muted contentment, like whetstone beneath dusk. And when one shoe is finished, he sets it beside its partner and begins again, his hand following the same path, his eyes scanning each stitch and seam as if looking not for flaws, but for familiarity, for the quiet reassurance that comes from knowing exactly what needs to be done and doing it without the intrusion of thought. And when both shoes are complete, he sets them on the upper shelf, where the afternoon light strikes just so, illuminating the gentle gleam of waxed leather and casting long shadows onto the wall behind them. And then, without a word, he returns to the wax pot, covers it again, wipes his fingers with a cloth already mottled with use, and sits back in his chair with a sigh that is not exhaustion, but release, a breath exhaled into the silence of the afternoon, a silence so deep that even the ticking of the distant wall clock feels respectful, as if it, too, knows that some moments are best left undisturbed just after the light begins to tilt into its amber hour, when the sun stretches shadows long across the workshop floor and paints the dust in soft gold. The shoemaker hears the faintest tap at the door, not a knock, not a demand, but something between hesitation and habit, and without looking up from his bench, he murmurs a gentle, "Enter," and in steps a man whose footsteps seem more like the brushing of fabric than the weight of boots, a man whose age is hard to guess, not because he is youthful, but because he carries time like folded linen, clean, quiet, and full of memories. And he does not remove his hat, nor speak right away, but stands near the wall where the finished shoes are lined, his eyes traveling slowly across each pair, as if they are portraits in a gallery, not products for sale. And the shoemaker, used to the silence of such visits, lets the man wander, watching from the corner of his eye, as the visitor eventually pauses before a modest pair of black ankle boots, well made but unadorned, their lines clean, the stitching tight and precise. And finally, the man speaks, voice low and hoarse like old paper, saying only, "These, like these," and from his worn satchel, he produces a pair of shoes, so tired, so softened by years of wear, that they no longer stand upright, but rather lean inward, like two elderly friends, resting against one another. And the shoemaker receives them carefully, not as a transaction, but as if accepting something precious. He studies the creases, the bent heel, the way the sole has worn thin near the toe but not the heel, suggesting a gait that begins heavily but softens by the end of each step. And he nods once, not as a promise but as an understanding, and gestures for the man to sit, not at the workbench, but in the chair by the window, a place reserved for those who wait with patience. And while the man settles, hands folded, gaze distant, the shoemaker begins his careful inspection, not with haste or tools, but with his fingers, running them slowly along the seams, lifting the tongue, checking where the stitching has pulled loose and where it still holds. And the work to come is not complicated, but it must be faithful, not a replacement, but a remembrance. The new shoes must feel like the old ones did 10 years ago, before the rainstorm that soaked them through, before the heel began to click against cobblestones, before the man began to walk a little more slowly each season. And as the shoemaker notes these things silently, the man by the window remains still, not asleep, but resting in that quiet way some people learn with age, where the body conserves energy, not because it is weak, but because it knows where not to waste it. And the shoemaker sets the shoes down gently on the cloth beside him, picks up a notepad to mark the measurements he will take shortly, and glances once toward the window, where the man's eyes now rest on the sky, not searching, not longing, but simply watching the color change, the pale blue giving way to lavender and rose. And in this moment, the shoemaker does not speak, for there is nothing that needs to be said, only the unspoken agreement between two men who understand that the smallest comforts, a well-fitting shoe, a quiet room, the glow of evening light, can sometimes hold more weight than any conversation ever could. It begins with the faintest change in light, not darker exactly, but softer, as if someone has draped a pale cloth over the sun, filtering its warmth and replacing its clarity with a subtle hush. And then, a few moments later, the sound comes, light at first, like someone scattering rice onto a wooden table, a dry patter on the terracotta tiles above the workshop, the rain announcing itself. not with thunder or drama, but with a patient, steady rhythm. And the shoemaker does not look up immediately, but tilts his head just slightly, enough to listen. For rain has many voices, and this one, early autumn rain, is the kind that lingers, the kind that seeps slowly into the city's bones, softening the edges of door frames and stirring the smell of earth and stone from the corners of alleyways. And the workshop responds as it always does, shrinking into itself ever so gently. The leather tightens with the shift in humidity. The floorboards creak more often, and the windows fog at the corners where the old putty has cracked. And yet this change is not unwelcome. Rather, it is familiar, even welcomed, for the shoemaker knows that some of his best stitching happens on days like this, when the world outside slows just enough to match the measured pace of his work. And today, as he finishes trimming the heel of a woman's slipper, one made of soft reddish hide, lined with felt, he places it beside its partner and stands to stretch, his hands still stained faintly with dye, and walks toward the front window, not to see the street, but to watch the way the rain pools in the dips between tiles, gathering slowly and spilling in tiny waterfalls off the edge of the roof. And below, the alley shines darkly, its flagstones slick and dappled, reflecting the blurred outlines of laundry lines and wooden shutters. And across the way, the bakery's chimney sends out a slow column of smoke that curls oddly in the damp air, like a thought that can't quite decide where to go. And somewhere a bell rings, once, far away, perhaps a convent, perhaps the afternoon service, the sound softened by the rain, but still floating through the air, like the echo of a memory. And the shoemaker leans his shoulder against the window frame and closes his eyes, just briefly, letting the sound of the rain blend with the silence of his shop, forming a kind of lullaby, not to sleep, but to remind him that the world beyond the walls still turns, even when it does so softly. And when he finally returns to his bench, he moves without hurry, selects the next sole to trim, and resumes his work to the soft tapping of the rain above him. The workshop filled not with noise or motion, but with the kind of quiet that allows each breath, each cut, each stitch to feel like its own small ceremony, performed not for show, but because it must be done, and done well, even and especially on a day when the rain stays on the roof, near the bottom of the tall work cabinet, beneath the shelves where polished lasts rest like sleeping limbs, and beside the boxes of thread arranged by thickness and hue, there is a deep drawer, wider than the others, with a wooden handle so smooth it almost feels like leather itself. And inside that drawer lives a collection of offcuts, not scraps, for scraps are what one throws away, but offcuts, pieces with potential, edges trimmed with purpose, remnants of past projects saved not for necessity, but for the belief that no piece of leather, once touched and shaped by the hand, is without value. And the drawer is filled with these forgotten shapes, curled at the corners from years of rest, each one a shade of brown or black or rusted red, some embossed faintly with grain, others smoothed by repeated handling. Some are narrow strips, like thin ribbons that once framed a boot's tongue. Others are odd crescents, curved pieces left behind from cutting arches or insteps, and a few are square and stiff, hardened by the drying of old dye. And though the shoemaker does not visit this drawer daily, it remains part of the living memory of the workshop, a quiet archive of choices made. And today, as the afternoon deepens and the sound of rain above becomes gentler still, almost a whisper, he pulls open the drawer, just far enough to sift through the pieces, not searching for anything in particular, but letting his fingers move through the layers like a reader thumbing the pages of a worn book. And as he touches each piece, stories return in small fragments. The tall riding boots for the widow's son, stitched with a dark green thread, the merchant's narrow shoes made from pale goatskin, requested with a strange urgency the week before a festival, the child's tiny sandal, never collected, still resting in a box upstairs, and these offcuts, quiet and unspoken, seem to hum with the weight of these unremarkable histories, not grand tales, but useful ones, and he selects one, a narrow strip the color of old tobacco, its surface marred by a faint nick, and turns it in his hand before setting it aside, not to use, but simply to acknowledge. And for a while he simply stands there, hand resting on the edge of the drawer, breathing in the scent that rises from the worn leather, warm, a little, dusty, faintly sweet like old books. And then, as the bell in the far piazza tolls the next hour, he closes the drawer gently, as if not to wake something sleeping, and returns to his workbench, and in doing so, carries with him not the offcuts themselves, but the feeling of what they represent, that in a life of quiet labor and small creations, even what is not used can still have a place, can still remind the hands of what they have done, and the heart of why they keep doing it. Day after slow and steady day, there is a quiet part of the process that no one outside the trade ever notices. A step so soft, it leaves no sound, no scent, and only the faintest trace, the chalk marks, those temporary, pale lines that guide the blade and the needle but vanish long before the shoe is finished. And the shoemaker, seated as always at his broad wooden bench, with its worn edge and tiny flecks of old polish embedded in the grain, holds the chalk in his fingers, not like a child drawing, but like a cartographer sketching the first lines of a map onto unfamiliar land. The piece of leather stretched before him, supple and dark, still bearing the scent of tanning and oil, is unmarked, full of potential, and with the white stub of chalk, flat on one side from years of use, he begins to trace, not quickly or with flourish, but carefully, just enough pressure to leave a visible thread of powder, a whisper of where the seam will go, where the tongue will fold, where the curve of the heel will begin to rise, and these marks, ghostly and impermanent, exist only to disappear. They do not need to be erased, because the work itself will remove them. The stitching will cover them. The trimming will cut them away. The wax and polish will bury them under sheen. And yet they are necessary, vital even, the quiet directions that keep the hands moving without doubt. And the shoemaker, as he draws each arc and notch, does not speak, does not think in words, but simply listens to the soft scrape of chalk on hide, a sound that is almost nothing, but still manages to calm the breath, to slow the heart. And there is something almost meditative about it. This creation of marks destined for erasure. This act of trust that what he envisions will take shape, even if the guide disappears. And sometimes, when the afternoon light is especially angled, golden and low, he tilts the leather just slightly and sees the faint shimmer of older marks, patterns from past shoes, half erased but still ghosting through, a reminder of how many souls have passed across this bench. And he pauses, not to correct, but to acknowledge, and then continues, drawing the next line, steady and thin, the chalk trailing like mist over stone. And when at last the piece is fully marked, the leather looks almost like a script, written in a forgotten language, full of arcs and ticks and subtle cues meant only for the maker. And without fanfare, he sets down the chalk, dusts the leather with the side of his palm, and begins to cut, each line followed with care, each curve respected, and the chalk begins to vanish, stroke by stroke, as the shoe slowly comes into being, shaped not by force, but by faith in those faint, fading guides that were never meant to last. And in that, the shoemaker finds something oddly comforting, that even the most temporary marks, if made with purpose, can shape something meant to endure. It is a tool so ordinary, it barely draws the eye, resting just off to the side of the bench, its wooden handle slightly curved, the grain darkened by years of touch, and its head worn to a shine at the rounded end where it has met hundreds, perhaps thousands, of nails, tacks, and soles. And yet the shoemaker reaches for it with the same quiet reverence he might show a cherished heirloom, because this hammer is not merely for striking, but for knowing. It carries a weight not just of metal, but of memory, and method balanced perfectly in his grip, the kind of balance that tells the hand exactly where to guide it before it has even moved. And today, as the workshop lies still in the quiet hours after rain, the stones outside steaming slightly in the lingering warmth, he lifts the hammer with both familiarity and care, preparing to drive a row of brass tacks through the edge of a thick leather sole, the nails held ready in a small dish beside him, their golden heads catching the light like tiny coins. And he begins, not quickly, but with the same deliberate pace that has governed every action in this place, placing the tack, adjusting the angle, and then lowering the hammer slowly, letting gravity begin the motion, his wrist guiding it, only enough to give purpose to the fall. And the sound it makes is not loud, not jarring, but solid, a soft, dense thump that seems to settle into the very wood of the bench and echo gently up into the walls. And he repeats it again and again, each strike neither rushed nor delayed, each one spaced evenly like heartbeats. And with every tack that sinks into the leather, the shape of the shoe becomes more certain, more real, the layers pressed into unity, not with force but with patience. And in between strikes, he adjusts the leather slightly, runs his fingers along the curve of the heel, tests the flex of the sole, and all the while, the hammer rests in his palm like an extension of himself, as if the weight of it helps to anchor him to the moment, to keep his thoughts from drifting too far from the task at hand. and he thinks, briefly, of how many times he has used this same hammer to build, to mend, to teach, to fix a buckle for a neighbor's child, or a seam for a stranger passing through, and it has never needed replacing, because it was made well and cared for, and as the last tack goes in and the heel sits firm and flush, he holds the hammer still for a moment, not yet returning it to its place, but letting it rest in his lap while he listens to the world around him, the faint creak of the stool beneath him, the subtle tick of the wall clock, the soft shift of the apprentice sweeping in the next room. And then, only then, does he set the hammer down, letting it settle into its hollow beside the awl, and wipes the tack dust from his hands with a cloth already marked by many such tasks. And the shoemaker, feeling the quiet satisfaction of work done steadily, returns to the next piece, the weight of the hammer still lingering faintly in his palm like a remembered kindness, a companion in the long and peaceful rhythm of making, as the shadows in the workshop grow longer, stretching lazily across the scuffed floorboards and reaching like fingers toward the far corners of the room. The shoemaker begins the ritual he performs at the end of every day, not because anyone asks it of him or because the work demands it, but because the act itself brings closure, a way to smooth the edges of time and signal to the hands and mind that the day is gently folding into night. And so he rises from his stool slowly, feeling the mild stiffness in his knees and lower back, and takes the cloth from its hook near the door. Not a new cloth, not pristine, but soft with wear and stained with use, just right for the work to come. And he begins at the far end of the bench, where the day's leather scraps have gathered like fallen leaves, brushing them into a neat pile with a few patient sweeps of his palm, letting the grain of the wood show itself again. And then the cloth comes into play, working in gentle, overlapping circles across the surface, catching the specks of dust, the faint wax residue, the subtle imprint of fingertips that pressed, trimmed, and stitched since morning. And each tool is then taken up in turn. The awl, the knife, the thread snips, the smooth-handled creaser, and each one is wiped down softly, checked for dullness or signs of wear, and returned to its proper place, not merely put away, but placed with quiet attention, like one sets down a book they intend to read again tomorrow. And this process, slow and deliberate, is accompanied by the ambient creak of the building, settling for the night, the gentle breeze coming through the high window, and the almost musical clink of tools, lightly tapping wood, and even the apprentice, who has long since gone home, seems present in spirit, his small pile of misplaced tacks having been gathered and returned to their tin, his seat tucked in without being asked, and the shoemaker, humming very softly to himself, perhaps without even realizing it, moves toward the shelves where finished shoes rest in rows, some polished to a gentle shine, some wrapped in cloth and awaiting delivery, all lined up like quiet guests at a table, their silence part of the room's stillness, and he dusts around them, careful not to disturb, before lowering the oil lamp's flame just slightly, not to extinguish it, but to dim the light in preparation for the final hour. And at last, when every surface is clean, every drawer shut, and every thread snipped and coiled for another day, he steps back and looks over the room, not with pride, but with a slow exhale of contentment, the kind that says nothing grand has happened and nothing needed to, only a day of honest work, carefully done, now gently folded away, like a well-worn coat at day's end. And with that, he reaches for his own shoes, well made, but plain, slips them on with practiced ease, and walks to the door, not rushing, not lingering, only moving as one who trusts that tomorrow will come with more shoes to make, more leather to mark, and more quiet hours to spend among tools and thread and the soft, faithful rhythm of work. Tucked just beneath the main bench, half shadowed by the overhang of a leather hide, draped to soften the light, rests the old wooden stool, plain, low to the ground, with 3 stubby legs, and a seat polished not by varnish, but by decades of use. And though it creaks softly every time it's moved, the shoemaker never thinks to replace it, for the stool has served more faithfully than most things ever could, bearing the weight not just of his body, but of his days, holding up hour after hour of quiet work, from the early days of apprenticeship through the long stretches of masterhood, always there beneath him, always still. And this morning, as he gently pulls it forward with one foot and lowers himself onto it with a familiar forward-leaning motion, he notes the way the wood feels slightly warmer than usual, likely from the sun that filtered through the shutters earlier and struck it just so, and he sits, spine curved, in that way his muscles have memorized, hands falling naturally to the bench above, knees parted slightly, the soles of his own shoes resting firmly on the packed floor. And as the day progresses, the stool bears witness to everything, though it makes no protest, no claim. It is there for the drawing of chalk lines, for the trimming of heels, for the winding of thread through the beeswax block, and it rocks gently when the shoemaker shifts to reach for a new tool, groans a bit when he leans too far forward, but never falters, and over time the stool has taken on a faint tilt, as if it leans with him into the work, a partner in patience, and when customers come, they rarely notice it, too busy admiring the shoes or scanning the walls of finished soles. But those who stay long enough, those who sit across from the bench and speak not of shoes, but of rain or crops or the price of wool, sometimes glance down and smile at the stool, sensing its humble loyalty, and the shoemaker, though he never speaks of it, sometimes runs his fingers absent-mindedly over the ridges in its surface, feeling the slight groove where his thumb rests during long pauses, the fine scratches left by the apprentices dropped all years ago, the faint burn mark from an overturned oil lamp during a storm, each one a small memory etched into the seat like the lines of a well-read face. And as the shadows in the room begin to shift, again, the light no longer golden, but leaning toward slate, the shoemaker stretches slightly, pushing his heels into the ground and rocking back with care, letting the stool carry his full weight for a moment longer before he stands. And when he does, he slides it gently back beneath the bench, where it disappears once more into partial darkness, waiting quietly, without complaint or expectation, to lift him again tomorrow, when the light returns and the work begins anew. In the shoemaker's world, there are many acts that repeat themselves, day after day, some loud and forceful, like the strike of a hammer or the slicing pull of a blade through thick hide, and others so small, so silent, they could pass unnoticed. Yet these quiet acts carry with them the deep weight of routine, like the steady rhythm of threading the needle, an action the shoemaker performs without spectacle, without urgency, but with the same care and consistency as one might use to close a window before the evening air cools. And today, like most days, as the shadows outside begin to shift and the warm scent of wax and old wood fills the room, he reaches for the linen thread wound in a thick coil on a wooden spool that has sat on the shelf for as long as he can remember, its fibers slightly rough, its color a muted cream like the inside of a walnut shell. And from this coil, he pulls a long stretch, arm's length, and then a little more, running it gently through his fingers to feel for flaws, tiny knots, or loose strands, smoothing it before drawing it once, then twice, through the solid block of yellow beeswax that rests in its shallow dish, and the wax coats the thread slowly, thickening it just enough to slide through leather without fraying, and as he presses it down into the wax with his thumb, the slight resistance makes a faint sound, not quite a squeak, more a whisper, a rustling softness, like fabric folding in on itself. And then comes the moment of threading, the act so seemingly simple, yet requiring the same stillness of hand and precision of mind as any more dramatic task. He picks up the needle, its eye no wider than a grain of rice, and lifts one end of the waxed thread toward it, turning the angle just slightly until the light catches, then gently nudges it through with the practiced ease of someone who has done it thousands of times. And the thread obeys, slipping through cleanly, emerging on the other side where it will soon join its twin in a saddle stitch, the same motion over and over again, left, right, pull tight, and again. And as he threads the second needle for the opposite end of the thread, the ritual feels as much a part of the shoemaker's day as waking or eating, a moment of pause and focus before the stitching begins. And in that small span of time, everything else falls away. The sound of voices outside, the shifting of wood in the ceiling beams, the ticking of the wall clock, even the dull ache in his shoulders, all dim beneath the clarity of this quiet motion. And once the needles are ready, he lifts the sole he's been working on and aligns it with its upper, the holes already punched, the path already mapped, and begins to sew, slow and even. But for a while, it is not the stitching that matters, not yet. It is the threading itself, the gesture that begins all others, the promise wrapped into the thread's tension, held between his fingers with care, not flashy, not complex, but exact, steady, and utterly sure. At the very last step of the shoemaking process, long after the hides have been softened and cut, after the soles have been stitched with hundreds of even saddle stitches, after the seams have been waxed and the leather gently burnished with cloth and bone, there remains one small act, so minor it may go unnoticed by the customer, but not by the shoemaker, the setting of the finishing nail, not a structural element, not strictly required, but a tradition that has persisted across years and apprenticeships, passed down not as law, but as a gesture, a way to say, this shoe was made with care, and the nail itself is short and fine, no larger than the width of a little finger's nail, with a slender head that catches just enough light to make itself known when the sun hits the heel just so. And today, as the shoemaker sits quietly at his bench with the finished pair of ankle boots resting before him, their surface oiled to a soft sheen, their soles trimmed and smoothed, their stitching clean and precise, he lifts the tiny nail from its place in the tin, feeling its coolness between thumb and forefinger, and holds it up to the light, turning it slightly to inspect the shape, the straightness, not because he expects flaws, but because this moment deserves attention. And then, with a slow exhale, he takes the right boot in his left hand and holds the heel firmly, pressing it against the bench for resistance, and aligns the nail at the center of the heel's edge, not directly in line with the others, but just slightly to the side, enough to mark the work as his. And he lifts the small silver hammer, used only for this purpose, not the heavier tool for tacks, and taps once, twice, then a third time, each strike precise and soft, the sound high and clear, like the soft knock of porcelain on wood, and the nail sinks in cleanly, flush with the leather, leaving no raised edge, no ripple in the grain, only a soft circle of silver that gleams gently against the darker leather. And he repeats the act for the left boot, matching it in placement, but not exactly, for no two shoes are ever truly identical, not when made by hand. And once both are finished, he sets them side by side on the worn cloth, stepping back slightly to observe not just the shoes, but the feeling of finality that settles in the room, the quiet that follows completion, a silence not empty, but full. And in that moment, the shoemaker feels not pride exactly, but a deep, steady satisfaction, like the gentle closing of a well-bound book, like the turning of a page that doesn't need to be read again, because everything that needed to be said has been said. And as the light from the window shifts slightly, striking the nails and making them glint, for just a second, he nods to himself, barely perceptible, then turns back to his tools, ready to begin again, not because he must, but because there is peace in the rhythm, in the quiet repetition of craft, and in the soft, nearly invisible mark left behind by a single, finishing nail. There are certain voices that never really leave you, even after the person who carried them is long gone. And for the shoemaker, as he moves through the slower hours of a quiet morning, with the shutters cracked just enough to let in a pale wedge of sun, the voice of his old master, not heard aloud in years, still echoes now and then, not as a memory to be summoned, but as something that rises of its own accord, usually during the most ordinary motions, like cutting a heel strip or selecting thread from a jar. And today, as his fingers work slowly over a new pair of soles, measuring for a light taper near the toe, he hears it, low, deliberate, a little rough around the edges from years of pipe smoke and cold workshops, saying something simple and direct. Don't rush what lasts. Leather knows when you lie to it. And though the shoemaker smiles faintly at the sound, he doesn't stop his work, doesn't look up or pause to reflect, because this is not a memory he needs to examine. It's one that lives alongside him, stitched into his hands like muscle memory. And he recalls the way the old man used to stand behind him, arms folded, his eyes rarely blinking, correcting without cruelty, but never offering praise too easily, always trusting the process to teach as much as words could. And more than once, when the shoemaker was still a boy, with more questions than skill, he had heard that voice murmur from across the room, start over, without explanation, leaving him to figure out what hadn't been right. And though it had frustrated him then, he now recognizes the gift in that. The freedom to discover not just how to make shoes, but how to understand them. To notice how a stitch that's too tight can warp the line of a boot's upper. How a sole placed half a hair off center will wear unevenly with time. And as he smooths the leather before him, he finds himself murmuring the same phrase the master once repeated often. It's not finished when it looks done. It's finished when it feels quiet. And perhaps that is why the shoemaker takes so long on the final pass of a cloth, or why he adjusts a heel curve 3 times before he's satisfied, not for perfection's sake, but for that feeling, that moment when the work no longer pulls at his attention, no longer feels unsettled. And though the master is long buried, his workshop long shuttered and sold, the shoemaker still hears him from time to time, in the stillness, in the creak of a stool, in the weight of a well-held awl. And there is no sadness in this echo, only continuity, a thread passed down, not by inheritance or blood, but by repetition, by the rhythm of hands doing the same work day after day, until the work begins to speak in the same voice, soft, firm, and steady, like a teacher who never fully leaves. There comes a time, often unspoken and always approached with a quiet humility, when even the shoemaker must turn his skilled hands to the repair of his own shoes, not because they are unwearable or because they've failed, but because after years of loyal use, of soft mornings spent walking cobbled alleys to the tannery, or slow evenings returning from the market with bread wrapped in linen, they have begun to soften in places where they should remain firm, and fray in places where the thread once lay strong. And today, as the light filtering through the shutters paints slow golden lines across the bench, he lifts his own shoes onto the cloth, not with haste or guilt, but with the same care he might offer a friend who has waited patiently to be seen. The leather is worn a shade darker now, rich with polish and time, the creases at the toes deep and soft like laugh lines, the soles smoothed by years of rhythm across wood, stone, and earth. And he turns one shoe gently in his hands, noticing how the inner seam has begun to part, just a thread or two, but enough to catch his eye, and so he prepares the thread and wax just as he would for any customer, measuring it slowly, drawing it through the block of beeswax until the fibers are sleek and bound. And though the task is small, there is a kind of reverence to it, a stillness that comes with the act of tending to something that has carried you, and he threads the needle with his usual care and begins to sew, not hurried, not distracted, but present, each stitch familiar, yet somehow more intimate now. Now, as if by repairing the shoe, he is acknowledging not just its service, but his own quiet journey. And with each pass of the needle, he remembers the places these shoes have gone, the wet steps near the Arno in winter, the warm brick of the oven, house where he once delivered a pair to the baker's eldest, the soft mud at the edge of the olive grove, where he once slipped and laughed to himself, even though no one had seen. And now, as the stitches hold the seam closed again, neat and firm, he knots the thread carefully, trims it, and smooths the area with the curve of his thumb. And then he buffs the leather, gently, with an old cloth worn thin, coaxing a soft shine from the toe caps, not for show, but for the comfort of knowing they are whole again. And when both shoes are finished, he sets them side by side on the low stool near the window and sits for a moment just looking at them, not as objects or projects, but as companions. And in that moment, there is no rush, no client awaiting collection, no need to speak, only the quiet satisfaction of caring for the thing that has quietly, faithfully carried you. And he lets the moment linger, then returns to his bench, ready to begin again, the shoes resting in the light like two old friends, polished and waiting, saying nothing at all, but ready to walk once more. In the lull between tasks, when the last stitch has been knotted and the heel polish left to dry in the gentle air drifting through the half-opened shutters, the shoemaker turns to one of those quiet, unrushed duties that demand no mental calculation or hurried movement, the sorting of leather scraps, not by color or size, but by texture, by feel. And though others might discard such remnants, treating them as waste, he considers them companions of the craft, small echoes of larger pieces, each bearing the scent and surface of some past creation. And so he lifts the small crate from beneath the bench, sets it on the table with a muted thud softened by the cloth, and begins to reach in with both hands, not looking, but feeling, letting his fingers brush over the hides, one by one, letting memory rise, not through the eye, but through the skin. There is the pebbled grain of oxhide, thick and slightly ridged like bark, the velvety nap of suede, delicate and whisper soft, sliding like breath across the fingertips, the smooth, almost cold press of calfskin, taut and fine-grained, nearly silent in the hand. And he sorts them slowly into neat piles, not speaking, not rushing, placing one here, another there, sometimes pausing to test the bend, or run a thumb gently over the edge to feel how the fibers hold or give. And this tactile meditation, as it were, becomes a kind of map of the day's work and the ones before it, a quiet logbook of shoes made, boots shaped, heels built, and soles stitched. And sometimes he lingers a little longer on a piece that feels familiar, the supple brown that lined the winter shoes for the magistrate's wife, the creased gray that formed the tongue of a pair meant for a merchant who never returned for them. And there is a kind of peace in this soft curation, as if by putting these textures in order, he is calming not only the bench, but the breath, organizing not only remnants of leather, but stray thoughts, too, and the sounds that accompany him are few. The soft rustle of hide against hide, the occasional tap of a nail when his elbow bumps the jar, the creak of the bench beneath him, adjusting to his slight shifts, and outside, the doves in the alley coo faintly, while the sun grows warmer, more golden, brushing the upper edge of the workroom wall, and when at last the crate is empty and the piles sorted, rough to one side, soft to the other, thick and thin each given their place, he covers them gently with a folded cloth, tucks the crate back under the bench, and wipes his palms slowly on his apron, as if closing a book he wasn't quite reading, but needed nearby, all the same. And for a moment longer, he sits, fingers resting on the table, sensing the lingering textures in his fingertips, textures not seen but known, not heard but felt, and then, with a nod to no one in particular, he stands and moves to the next task, leaving behind the sordid scraps like sleeping thoughts, organized and undisturbed. The day begins not with a bell or command or the ticking of any strict hour, but with the turning of a key in a door that has groaned the same soft complaint for years. And though the streets of Florence are not yet bustling, though the shutters above the bakery remain closed, and the voice of the fishmonger has not yet called down the alley, the shoemaker arrives, as he always does, wrapped in the calm slowness of early light and the familiar weight of a wooden key in his palm. The key, long and brass, shaped by use more than design, fits into the lock with a practiced motion, not forced, but eased, the kind of gesture learned not through instruction, but repetition. And as he turns it, there is a faint click, and the door gives slightly, not swinging wide, but resisting for a breath, before creaking open into the cool quiet of the shop, where the scent of leather and wax and wood dust lingers from the night before, and for a moment he stands just inside the threshold, not stepping forward, but simply letting the morning settle into the room, the light from outside soft and pale, falling across the workbench in long, thin lines that reveal the grain of the wood and the soft flecks of dust in the air. And then, as if exhaling, he crosses the threshold, shuts the door behind him with care, and draws back the shutters with a pair of slow, even movements, letting in the full light of the new day, not harsh or bright, but diffuse and golden, brushing the tops of the tools, sliding across the pile of leather remnants, warming the corner where the apprentice's stool still sits, slightly askew, and he moves through the room without urgency, lighting the small oil lamp not for need, but for companionship, setting the kettle on the brazier to begin its gentle hiss, and folding back the cover on the bench with a motion that has, over time, become less a task and more a form of greeting. And before any cutting or measuring begins, before thread is selected or a shoe is lifted for inspection, he sits for a moment, just sits, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely, watching the room in stillness. And in that stillness, he feels the floor settle, the wood creak faintly beneath him, and the small breath of wind from the open window carry the scent of early bread and stone warmed by a dawn. And this, he knows, is the beginning. Not the shoes waiting to be mended, nor the deliveries promised by week's end, but this quiet unlocking, this silent agreement with the day that whatever comes will come slowly, with care, and as he stands once more and reaches for his apron, he feels the weight of the key still in his pocket, still warm from his hand, a small token of all that has been locked and opened again and again, not because it must, but because it welcomes the work and the light and the stillness of starting. There is a small, slightly smudged pane of glass at the front of the shop, set into the wooden frame that creaks faintly when the wind passes just right, and through it the shoemaker can see a slice of the world, not the whole of the street or the grand arches of the distant piazza, but just enough of the narrow alley to notice the way the morning changes it, moment by moment, shadow to sunlight, silence to soft footsteps. And today, as the shop lies between tasks and the tools sit still upon the bench, he leans ever so slightly against the edge of the window frame, arms folded loosely, eyes quiet, letting the world unfold without needing to shape it. The cobbles outside are still damp from the earlier mist, their surfaces shining just faintly in the sun, and the first passerby, a baker's apprentice with a dusting of flour across his shoulder, moves past in a steady, unhurried gait, not noticing the shoemaker behind the glass, and a cat slips across the way, its fur the color of old bricks, its body threading the shadows with practiced ease, disappearing around the corner without sound. And far above, laundry hangs from a line between windows, unmoving, not yet stirred by breeze or hand. And as the shoemaker watches, he sees not events, but presence, not actions, but patterns, the small shifts that mark the day's rhythm. The cobbler's neighbor, leaning from her sill to shake a cloth, the merchant from 2 doors down sweeping the same stretch of stone he's swept every day for 20 years. And though the shoemaker says nothing, makes no note of these things aloud, he records them quietly in his stillness, storing them like scraps of leather folded into memory. And in these moments, no shoes are made, no soles are mended, but something just as necessary occurs, a slowing of breath, a tuning of the body to the hour, the surrender of time's forward pull, and the window, for all its age and fogged corners, becomes a kind of frame, not for art, but for life in its smallest, least urgent forms. And after a while, when the street begins to grow a little louder, when voices start to echo off the stone and the rattle of a cartwheel passes just out of view, he steps back from the glass, not because the view has ended, but because the work calls again, and he returns to his bench without speaking, without even sighing, only carrying with him the stillness of having watched the world pass by for a little while, untouched, and letting that stillness follow him into the rhythm of thread and leather once more. There is a particular kind of peace that settles in when the shoemaker sharpens his trimming blade, not because the act itself is grand or complex, but because it must be done slowly, with precision, and without any allowance for distraction. For the blade is not large, like a kitchen knife, nor curved like the leather shears, but small and flat, with a tapered edge that must remain clean and precise to glide along the contours of leather without tearing or dragging, and so he draws it from its resting place on the back edge of the bench, lifts the lid from the small tin where the whetstone is kept, a dull gray slab with tiny flecks of darker grit running through it, and places the stone gently on the cloth, centering it like a ritual object, then pours just a few drops of water from the clay pitcher beside him, watching as they bead and run slowly across the surface before being spread evenly with 2 fingers, circling until the stone's face glistens slightly. And then the blade is laid flat, not tilted, not forced, just resting against the stone like a whispered intention, and he begins to draw it slowly across, one side, then the other, with each stroke long and even, the sound barely more than a faint scrape, a soft repetition that becomes its own kind of rhythm, one that echoes faintly in the hollow of the workroom, filling the silence between breaths. And as the edge is honed, not made new, but made true, again, the shoemaker thinks of all the times this blade has done its quiet work, trimming the excess from a sole's edge, shaping the curve of a tongue, or shaving a strip of heel leather to just the right slant, and he knows the blade not as a tool, but as a partner, one that cannot be rushed, that will not forgive haste. And so he takes his time, checking the edge with the pad of his thumb, not pressing but grazing lightly, feeling for that balance between sharp and smooth, between readiness and danger. And when the blade is ready, he lifts it away from the stone and wipes it gently on a folded cloth, not scrubbing but blotting, then slides it back into its case with the same care one might use to place a letter inside an envelope. And though no shoe was cut in these moments, no stitch sewn or order completed, something essential was still accomplished. For now the blade will glide once more, and when the time comes to trim a freshly shaped heel or shave the lining of a slipper, it will do so without resistance, without sound. And as the shoemaker sets the stone aside and folds the cloth over the tools again, he feels the satisfaction that comes not from progress, but from preparation, the knowledge that something is ready, quiet, and waiting. And he returns to his bench, not with urgency, but with the calm of one who knows that care is not something you rush through, but something you return to again and again, like sharpening a blade before the cut. It is a part of the process so quiet that it nearly vanishes, a moment that is neither craft nor inspection in the usual sense, but something in between, where the shoemaker, having finished the last stitch and burnished the edge of a new pair of shoes, lifts one in each hand and simply holds them, not turning or studying, but feeling, letting the weight of each shoe speak in its own way, not through words, but through silence and small, almost imperceptible shifts. And in his hands, the shoes rest like questions waiting to be answered, their leather still stiff with newness, the soles flat but not yet scuffed, and he begins to tilt one slightly forward, just enough to let the toe touch the bench again, feeling how the weight flows from heel to ball to tip, not rushed, not mechanical, but intuitive, like listening for a heartbeat through the fingertips. And then he does the same with the second, noting whether the balance is the same, whether the shift of weight carries equally, whether the inner lining gives just slightly when pressed in the arch, and this part of the work, done without tools or measurement, depends on something deeper, years of memory, of hands trained by thousands of shoes, of a sense for symmetry so fine it cannot be taught. And as he rotates each shoe, gently pressing at the toe and heel, feeling for even the slightest irregularity, he closes his eyes for a moment, not to shut out the room, but to better hear the silence of the shoes. And in that moment, he remembers the words of his old teacher once more, murmured during a lesson long ago. You don't look for flaw, you wait for it to reveal itself. And so he waits, hands poised, heart unhurried, until he finds none, until both shoes, in their shape and weight and feel, seem to rest back into his palms with the quiet surety of things done well, and only then does he lower them gently onto the cloth, side by side, adjusting them with 2 fingers until they aligned perfectly, not for display, not for pride, but for the quiet order it brings to the bench, like stones placed just so, in a garden path. And outside, a dove coos softly on the windowsill, and the light through the shutter falls across the shoes like a benediction, warming the leather with a pale gold glow. And though no one will ever know how long the shoemaker spent just holding those shoes, just listening for imbalance and finding none, he knows, and in the deep stillness of the shop, that knowing is more than enough. In a small wooden drawer beneath the bench, lined with a faded square of blue linen, there rests a small collection of brass buckles, some round, some squared, a few with curled corners that catch the light when turned just right, and each one, though simple and seemingly identical to the untrained eye, holds its own slight variation, a thicker tongue here, a smoother prong there, a faint ridge worn into the back of one from where it rubbed once against a rider's spur. And today, the shoemaker opens that drawer with the same slow care he gives to every small part of the process, reaching in and selecting 2 buckles of matching shape and tone, each with a soft, aged sheen that speaks not of neglect, but of waiting, waiting for the right pair of shoes, the right moment, the right hands, and he lifts them one by one, setting them gently on the bench, then takes up the small cloth he uses only for brass, a square of thick cotton worn smooth from years of circular motion, folded at the corners where polish has hardened over time, and dipping the tip into the smallest dab of oil, not perfume or cleaner, just olive oil from the same press that supplies his kitchen. He begins to work it gently into the metal with the pad of his thumb, circling inward and outward, not pressing hard, but with the sort of pressure that warms rather than scrubs. And as he polishes, the dullness fades, not entirely, not into a mirror bright shine, but into something quieter, a soft gleam like sunlight on old water, warm and patient. And he does not rush the process, for to polish a buckle too quickly is to miss the feeling of the cloth catching ever so slightly on a tarnished edge, or the shift in temperature as the brass heats under his touch. And each motion is deliberate, not repetitive, but rhythmic. Each pass of the cloth bringing with it not just clarity of surface, but a sense of finality, of approach. For once the buckles are clean, they will be sewn into place, their little prongs tucked through holes so small they can barely be seen, their posts nestled into loops that were shaped just for them, and by then, no one will think of how they once rested in a drawer, dull and forgotten, nor of how they were polished in silence while a kettle murmured faintly in the corner. But the shoemaker will know, will remember the smell of oil on cloth, and the way the afternoon light struck the bench just then, turning the brass to gold for a single moment. And so he works, slow and steady, finishing one, then the other, placing them side by side as if they were twins preparing for a journey, not destined for display or admiration, but for a lifetime of use. And when they're done, he wipes his hands clean on the cloth, folds it again into its square, and slides the drawer gently shut as the light shifts across the floor, and another small task, perfectly finished, fades quietly into the rhythm of the day. There comes a moment, usually sometime after midday, when the sun begins to shift from its sharp climb to a warmer, more forgiving slant, when the shoemaker sets down his tools, not abruptly, not with a sigh or a groan, but with a quiet certainty, as if his hands have reached a natural pause and chosen rest without needing to be asked. And he leans back slightly on his stool, palms resting on his thighs, eyes not closed, but not quite open either, gazing at the far wall, but seeing little, because now he is listening, not to anything urgent or specific, but to the murmurs of the city just beyond the thick stone walls and open shutters. And in that soft chorus, there is no order, no melody, just life, the faint clatter of a cartwheel on uneven stone, the high voices of children bouncing off sun-warmed walls, the sudden squawk of a pigeon flapping too close to a clothesline, the hollow ring of a bell far off, tolling once, then again, marking the hour with more grace than precision. And these sounds, muffled and distant though they are, form a kind of backdrop to the shoemaker's stillness, a gentle hum that neither pulls him from his seat nor urges him forward, but rather surrounds him, like warm water cradles the body. And somewhere, someone is hammering iron, the strikes spaced and unhurried, as if the blacksmith, too, has decided today does not require speed. And from the bakery at the corner, a faint clang of the oven door echoes briefly, followed by the scent of bread, sweet and yeasty, drifting in a current of air that pushes softly through the window and stirs the edge of the cloth covering the heel molds. And the shoemaker breathes it all in, not deeply or dramatically, but slowly, letting the city's rhythm settle against his chest. And in doing so, he feels not separate from the world outside, but gently sewn into it, as if by threads too fine to see. And though no words pass his lips, and no step is taken, the shoemaker is part of it, part of the city's hum, part of its breathing, part of its quiet, unhurried pulse. And after some time, when the moment has passed, when the voices have drifted down the alley, or the cart has rounded the far corner, he reaches again for his all, or his last, or his cloth, returning to the work, not as if waking from distraction, but as if he had been working all along, just with different tools. The tool, this time, being stillness. And as he leans forward once more and resumes the task, the city continues, its murmur behind him, neither louder nor quieter, only constant, only there, a soft song that needs no audience, only a listener every now and then. There are tasks that hold no prestige, that announce themselves not with urgency, but with quiet inevitability. And among them, sweeping the floor stands as one of the simplest and most grounding. And today, as the sun leans toward late afternoon and the slant of light shifts further across the bench, the shoemaker rises from his stool, not because he is finished with the shoe at hand, but because the floor beneath him feels cluttered with the soft remains of his morning's work. Leather shavings curled like dried leaves, flecks of thread too small to catch the eye unless the light hits just right, and a fine dust of powdered polish that settled invisibly across the flagstones. And so he steps to the corner where the broom leans, worn and wooden, its bristles no longer even, but still firm, still faithful, and lifting it without sound, he begins in one corner, furthest from the light, drawing the bristles across the stone with long, slow strokes that catch everything in their path, not harsh, not hurried, but deliberate, like the careful movement of waves across a shore. And he watches as the little pile of debris grows. A thread here, strip of leather there, even a nail that rolled beneath the bench and disappeared 2 days ago. And with each stroke, he feels something settle inside him, a kind of balance returning, as if cleaning the floor clears not only space but thought, and he does not hum or whistle, does not speak or glance toward the door, only moves in the slow, methodical circle of habit, drawing the mess inward from every corner until it gathers near the hearth in a quiet, crumbling hill, and then, bending gently, he sweeps it onto a worn scrap of parchment and carries it to the little bucket near the back, tipping it in without fanfare. And though the floor is not spotless, it is returned to a state of calm, the uneven stones once again visible, their edges traced by the broom's passage. And before placing the broom back in its corner, he gives it one final tap against the wall, a small motion that sends a puff of dust upward, catching briefly in the beam of sunlight before settling again. And standing there, in the silence that follows, the shoemaker rests his hands on his hips for a moment, then wipes them on his apron, not out of necessity, but from long habit. And he steps back to the bench, shoes still unfinished, work still waiting, but the space beneath him now cleared, as if the floor itself can breathe again. And in that quiet, the shop feels whole once more, as if the very act of sweeping, so small, so ordinary, has woven everything back into place. There are moments in the day when even the smallest action becomes an act of stillness, and as the late afternoon sun leans deeper into the sky, casting long amber shadows across the shop floor and leaving streaks of golden warmth across the edge of the workbench, the shoemaker finds himself once more at the edge of a quiet pause, lifting the tiny wooden bobbin from its tray with a sense of quiet routine, so practiced it barely feels like a decision at all. The bobbin, a narrow spindle smoothed by years of touch, feels light in his fingers, and he holds it for a second, between thumb and forefinger, before reaching for the spool of thread, a dark, burnished brown that has thinned slightly from use. its thread taut and ready, but not hurried, and he threads the end through the small notch of the bobbin, anchoring it with a soft twist before setting the bobbin gently between the padded points of the winding crank, the kind of hand-turned mechanism that creaks faintly when set in motion, not broken, not worn out, just well used. And he begins to turn the crank slowly, not watching the thread wrap so much as listening to it, to the soft rhythm of motion, the whisper of thread unwinding, the slight tension of wood turning against wood, and around the bobbin spins, its belly filling with steady coils of thread that lay themselves down in careful layers, neat and soft, and he adjusts the spool once, just to ensure the tension stays even, then continues, hand steady, breath calm, eyes occasionally flicking toward the window, where the light has now softened into the dusky gold that only appears near the end of quiet days. And this task, which might take no more than a few minutes, stretches into something unhurried and nearly sacred, not because of its importance, but because of the calm it demands, a calm that can't be faked or rushed, a calm that wraps around the shoemaker just as the thread wraps the bobbin. And when at last the bobbin is full, the thread lying flush with its edge, he stops the crank gently, cuts the thread with a small blade, and smooths the final layer with the pad of his thumb, checking it not with scrutiny, but with care, and then he lifts it free, places it softly in its dish beside the needle, and wipes his hands on his apron, not out of necessity, but in that quiet way people do when a task is complete, and they need a moment to acknowledge its quiet success. And the shop, as always, says nothing in return, only holds the stillness like a breath between thoughts, and waits with him for whatever small task might come next, as the edge of the sky begins to turn from gold to that softer shade of blue that signals the end of daylight. The shoemaker feels the slow pull of hunger, not sharp or urgent, but a gentle reminder that the day has begun to slip quietly toward evening. And so, with no ceremony and no need to speak aloud, he folds the cloth over his tools for the night, dusts his hands on the edge of his apron, and moves to the small hearth that warms the back corner of the shop, a space where a single iron pot rests above a few glowing coals, and beside it, a wooden board holds a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese wrapped in linen, and an earthen bowl filled with beans that have soaked since morning. And he begins with the bread, not slicing, but tearing, letting the crust break with a soft crackle in his hands, the inside still dense from yesterday's bake. He sets the pieces gently in a shallow bowl, then unwraps the cheese, running the knife slowly through it, watching as it parts with a smooth firmness that releases a faint scent of salt and age. And with the beans, he adds only a pinch of salt and a splash of oil, placing the pot carefully over the warmer coals, listening to the gentle hiss as the heat stirs it to life. No rush, no fire, just warmth that builds slowly, enough to coax flavor from simplicity. And while he waits, he pours a small cup of water from the jug nearby, the clay cool against his hand, the liquid silent as it settles, and he sits on the low stool by the fire, not watching the pot, but gazing at the flame's slow motion, letting the quiet between each flicker lull his thoughts into a slow drift. Outside, the street has quieted, the carts long past, the voices low and fewer, and even the cat that sometimes visits has curled against the doorframe, its tail tucked, its eyes half lidded, and in that silence, the pot gives off a faint bubbling sound, soft and rhythmic, like breath, and he stirs once, twice, with a wooden spoon worn smooth at the handle, then sets it aside and lets the heat finish what time began. And when at last the food is ready, he fills the bowl without excess, tears one more piece of bread from the crust, and eats slowly, without a word, chewing each bite as though it were part of the same careful work he gives to soles and stitches. And when he's done, he wipes the bowl with the last of the bread, swallows the water with one quiet sip, and sits still for a moment longer, not tired, not waiting, just full in that gentle, unremarkable way that feels more like contentment than satisfaction. And the fire crackles faintly beside him, the room dim but not dark, and as the embers begin to fade, so too does the day, closing without fanfare, as meals and evenings often do in the life of a shoemaker. After the meal, when the warmth of the beans still lingers faintly in his chest, and the final crust of bread has been brushed of its crumbs, the shoemaker does not rise quickly, nor sigh as though the day has worn him thin. Instead, he stays, seated for a few slow breaths, letting the stillness settle around him like evening mist until the moment arrives that he knows must come, the quiet ritual of washing the dishes. And so he stands, not with weariness, but with calm, and carries the wooden bowl, the simple spoon, and the clay cup toward the low shelf beside the basin, where a small pitcher of water sits waiting, its surface glimmering faintly in the soft glow of a single candle, now lit on the far side of the room. The flame dances gently, reflecting in the water as he pours a careful stream into the basin, the sound light and hollow, not a splash, but a hush, and with a scrap of linen, one used only for this purpose, and folded neatly after each use, he begins to wash, not with vigor or haste, but with slow, circular movements, turning the spoon in his fingers until every trace of oil and bean has dissolved beneath the gentle press of cloth and water. And when the bowl is washed, he rinses it with another small pour, careful not to waste a drop more than needed, and sets it upside down on the shelf to dry, the faint tap of wood on wood echoing softly in the room, and then the cup, which he swirls and rinses and wipes dry, and finally the spoon, smoothed by years of similar gestures, its surface worn to a silky dullness that catches no splinters, only memory. And once the work is done, he empties the basin outside the back door, tilting it with both hands, watching the water disappear into the earth without urgency, steam rising faintly as it meets the cool stone path, and returning, he folds the linen cloth over the edge of the shelf to dry and lowers the pitcher's lid with a soft click. And in the candlelight, everything now feels clean again, not spotless, not sterile, but restored. And as he moves back toward the center of the room, his hands still slightly damp and carrying the scent of wood, water, and olive oil, he does not think of the dishes as a chore completed, but as a thread tied, a small act that brings the day closer to its end, drawing a line beneath the meal, beneath the work, beneath the long quiet rhythm of life in a Florentine workshop. And he stands there, beside the table, beside the flickering candle, letting the stillness return, letting the evening deepen. And for a moment longer, he listens, not for sound, but for the absence of it, as peaceful and familiar as the weight of the shoes waiting in the corner for tomorrow. By the time the last of the day's tasks have faded into stillness, and the tools have been laid to rest beneath their linen cloths, and the light from the window has withdrawn entirely into the folds of night, there remains one final ritual that the shoemaker performs, not for the sake of habit alone, but because it is needed, deeply and quietly needed, by the hands that have stitched and scraped, folded and pressed, measured and smoothed their way through hours of leather, thread, and sole. And so, by candlelight, with the door latched and the street outside reduced to the occasional hollow clop of a distant mule, or the murmur of neighbors closing shutters, he pulls the small tin from the shelf, a round, dented thing, cool to the touch and faintly waxy, which he opens with a gentle twist. Inside is a salve of his own making, a mix of beeswax, olive oil, and a touch of rosemary, melted together over low flame weeks ago and cooled into a soft balm with a scent both earthy and clean. And he dips 2 fingers into it, slowly, warming it between his palms, letting it soften further with the heat of his skin. And then, with care that echoes the precision of his stitching, he rubs the balm into his hands, starting with the palms, where the skin is thickest and the wear most hidden, massaging it in circles that move outward toward the fingers, pausing to work it into the lines where knuckle meets knuckle, where calluses rise in silent witness to years of steady labor, and his thumbs move across each joint, not briskly, but with quiet reverence, as though in this act he is not merely easing soreness, but acknowledging the partnership between body and craft. And he does not hurry, does not multitask, does not speak, only breathes, slowly, in rhythm with the long motions of care. And the balm sinks into the lines of his skin, softening what was hardened, cooling what was raw, until each finger feels a little less tired, a little more like itself. And when at last he is done, he rubs the last of it into his wrists and presses his palms together once more, letting the warmth linger in the space between. Then he closes the tin, wipes the rim, and places it gently back in its corner. And as he flexes his fingers softly, testing their quiet readiness for tomorrow, he does not smile, does not speak, but feels something settle within him, as if the day itself has loosened its grip. And the candle flickers on, casting long shadows across the bench, across the stools, across the shoes that wait, and the hands that made them, now at rest, hold no weight, no task, only the comfort of being tended to, gently and without rush, as the silence of the evening deepens around them, when the last warmth of the day has faded and the room has grown dim, save for the amber flicker of the lone candle set near the hearth. The shoemaker knows, not by clock or bell, but by the steady weight of stillness in the room. That night has truly arrived. Not the night that falls like a curtain, but the one that settles in like a familiar companion, wrapping its arms around the quiet corners and tucking silence into the floorboards. And in this hour, there remains but one task, a gesture so small that it might go unnoticed by another, yet it marks the boundary between the waking world and rest. And so he rises from his stool, slow and without stiffness, as though the hours of work have not burdened him, but gently worn a groove into the shape of his day. And he moves toward the candle, its flame tall and steady, not yet guttering, but leaning ever so slightly with the whisper of evening air that slips through the shuttered slats. And from the shelf, he retrieves the wick trimmer, a small scissor-like tool with curved edges, dulled from age but precise in purpose, and holding it steady, he gently clips the wick, the blackened tip falling with a soft flick onto the stone tray beneath. The flame responds, shrinking momentarily, then returning, more compact, more golden, dancing less wildly now, as if it too understands that the time for brightness has passed. And he places the trimmer back in its drawer and lets his hand rest beside it for a moment, fingers still, as the silence stretches like a blanket across the floor. And then, one by one, he adjusts the shutters, letting in no light but the faintest suggestion of starlight, casting soft edges on the stone and wood. And with practiced motion, he turns down the lamp that sits in the corner, and the room becomes a nest of dimness, filled not with absence, but with comfort. And he moves to the small cot tucked against the back wall, unrolling the simple woolen blanket and smoothing the linen beneath it, not hurriedly, but with care, folding the edge just so, placing the pillow in line. And before he lies down, he stands for a moment beside the cot, hands resting loosely at his sides, gaze drifting across the room that now holds no tasks, only the softened echo of work completed, the shoes waiting on the shelf, the tools resting in their trays, the brush beside the bench, the apron hung neatly on its hook, all of it still, all of it quiet. And then he lies down, pulling the blanket up slowly, letting the warmth settle across his chest, and he turns once toward the wall, toward the candle's last glow, and allows his breath to slow into the rhythm of sleep. And outside, the city rests too, carts silenced, shutters drawn, voices hushed. And in this stillness, neither dream nor thought takes hold, only the long, uninterrupted drift of a shoemaker sleeping inside a workshop that has known nothing but gentle labor, soft light, and the endless hush of days folded gently into night before the bells ring out across Florence, and before the narrow stone streets below the workshop begin to carry the sound of footsteps and wagon wheels. There is a thinner, softer layer of morning, one that arrives on the backs of birdsong and slow light, and in this brief, sacred silence, the shoemaker stirs, not with alarm or urgency, but with the ease of someone whose life has learned to follow the rhythm of days that unfold gently. And he rises from his cot slowly, the woolen blanket folded back in one motion, his bare feet finding the cool floor as he sits for a moment on the edge of the bed, not moving, just breathing, eyes half closed, letting the newness of the day settle around his shoulders. And then, with quiet steps, he moves to the wooden shutters, their slats still holding back the outside world, and places his hand on the familiar latch, which clicks faintly beneath his fingers. And as he swings the shutters open, the room drinks in the early light, not bright or harsh, but soft and golden, casting long strips of brightness across the floor and catching the edges of tools and shoes in a way that makes everything seem touched, for a moment, by grace. The scent of the city enters next, subtle and layered: damp stone, baking bread from a far-off oven, the faintest hint of ash from a chimney still burning down, and below, the street is mostly empty, save for a woman drawing water from a well and the distant blur of a mule being led toward the market. And the shoemaker stands in the window's light, not leaning, not stretching, just watching, his arms loose at his sides, his breathing quiet. And for these few moments, there is no need for haste, no pressing task, no hammer to lift or soul to trim, just the quiet privilege of witnessing morning arrive. And in this light, the familiar shapes of his shop take on new texture, the workbench bathed in amber, the stool catching a warm halo, the row of leather scraps along the wall looking almost like parchment caught mid-story. And it is in this exact stillness that the shoemaker feels the quiet strength of beginning again, of another day to repeat the small sacred acts that make up a life. And though he does not speak or smile, something within him responds, like a thread pulled gently through cloth, and he turns from the window, now filled with the color of the new day, and moves toward the bench, not with purpose, but with presence, knowing that before the work begins, there must always be light, and before light, a moment to greet it. And in that greeting, the world feels gently whole once more, whole once more. The morning has fully settled into its rhythm. The shutters open wide now, letting in a stream of warm daylight that stretches across the worn flagstones and touches the tips of every shoe in the corner like sunlight brushing sleeping animals. And as the shoemaker hums faintly under his breath, fingers moving with quiet precision through a row of leather straps, needing to be sorted by width and strength, the door creaks open with the gentlest pressure, the sound familiar and soft, a sound that belongs only to those who know the weight of it. And standing there, as she has for so many years, is Signora Bartozzi, wrapped in her brown shawl, her hair pulled back in a modest braid, her left hand holding a pair of shoes, not new, not ruined, just worn enough to speak. And she doesn't step fully inside at first, only tilts her head in acknowledgement, her eyes meeting his with the silent comfort of shared years. And the shoemaker doesn't rise, doesn't greet her with words, only sets down the strap in his hand, dusts his palms on the side of his apron, and gestures gently to the bench beside the door, where she always sets them. And she does so now, placing them side by side, as if laying down a memory, the heels facing out, the toes perfectly aligned, shoes of a kind no longer made, with stitching he remembers doing perhaps 7 winters ago, when her husband was still alive, and she had come in with a letter in her pocket she never once read aloud. And as she settles the shoes, she speaks only 3 words, same as last time, which are not instruction, but permission. And he nods, not asking what was last time, for he remembers it was the worn heel, the loose insole, the scuff on the outer edge, from where she drags her foot slightly on uneven stone. And as she turns to go, he does not offer farewell, and she does not pause for one. They have long since passed the point of needing such things, and when the door shuts again, quietly and completely, he walks over and lifts the shoes in both hands, weighing them, rotating them gently, feeling for softness in the heel, for slackness in the sole. And in this task there is no rush, only the same deliberate touch he gives to all things. But here, layered into it, is the texture of memory, not a story told, but a history worn into the leather, and he places them on the bench, not apart from his other work, but among it, as if they belong. And in this silent exchange, in the arrival and departure of a woman who trusts him, not with her words, but with the objects that carry her forward each day, the shoemaker feels not gratitude or duty, but something simpler and more complete, the quiet honor of being known. And so, with the window open and the light moving steadily across the wall, he reaches for his awl and prepares to begin, the shoes waiting patiently, their wear familiar, their return already understood. The drawer sits just beneath the main workbench, close enough that the shoemaker's knee often brushes against it as he leans forward to stitch or burnish, but low enough that it's seldom opened unless the rhythm of the day calls for something quiet, something that does not demand outcome, but invites attention. And now, with the morning's repairs complete, and the sun casting long golden lines across the floor through the slats of the shutters, he feels the time is right to tend to it, not out of necessity, not because anything urgent lies within, but because order, in even the smallest corner of the shop, brings with it a kind of calm that soothes the air like a cool cloth pressed against a warm brow. And so he bends slowly, knees creaking softly under his linen trousers, and slides open the drawer with both hands, the motion gentle, the wood gliding against wood, with a faint whisper that only old furniture makes. Inside lies a patchwork history of past work, curls and corners of leather, in every shade the city has known, from warm chestnut to dark plum black, from dusty ochre to burnished olive. Some edges rough, where a pattern was cut, others smoothly rounded, as though they wore their unfinishedness with quiet dignity. And he lifts the first scrap, a narrow strip of pale tan calfskin, no wider than a finger and soft as parchment, likely trimmed from a child's sandal years ago. He runs it between his thumb and forefinger, not to judge it, but to remember it, to let it remind him of the grain, the finish, the way it gave slightly under a damp cloth, and he lays it aside, gently, atop a small linen square he has spread for the task. Next comes a heavier piece, deep brown and cracked along one edge, once part of a traveling boot, meant for winter roads, its weight balanced against frost and stone. This one he places in a separate pile, the sturdy ends, as he once labeled it in his head, for the scraps too thick for lining, but too beautiful to discard. And on he goes, one piece at a time, never rushing, each scrap turned over in his palm, Some sniffed lightly for the lingering scent of tannin or oil. Others pressed against his cheek to test their coolness, a trick he learned in apprenticeship to gauge how long leather has rested since it was last tooled. And as the drawer empties, slowly, the stories they hold begin to return. The olive green tongue from a noblewoman's slipper, requested after she caught it on a stone stair during a festival. The butter-colored scrap from a pair of gloves he once tried to make, but found his fingers too calloused to shape properly. That project, he recalls, with a soft exhale through his nose, was never finished. And he finds even smaller fragments, too small to reuse, too irregular to cut, yet too full of quiet significance to throw away. He places those in a separate corner of the cloth, his ghost pile, as he once called it aloud during a long winter night, when no one else was listening. Scraps that serve no function but memory, and outside the light shifts, a breeze, lifting briefly through the open window, brushing the edge of the cloth so that the smaller pieces flutter like leaves, shaken by thought. He pauses to still them with his palm, a weight not heavy but certain, as though reminding them they are not forgotten. And for a long stretch of time, though he does not count minutes, nor feel them passing like drops in a glass, he simply remains there, crouched before the drawer, sorting, folding, smoothing, layering one memory over another, like pages in a quiet book. And when he is done, or rather, when the drawer is empty and the cloth full of soft, sorted piles, he begins the return, not by sweeping the scraps back in all at once, but by building new layers, the liners in the far left, the heel patches in the middle, the maybes to the right, and the smallest shreds placed inside a folded envelope he made from parchment long ago, tied shut with a loop of thread too frayed for sewing. And once all is replaced, he slides the drawer shut with the same care as when he opened it, the motion slow and final, not like closing a cupboard, but like laying down the last stone in a garden path. And he rises slowly, knees steady, and returns to the bench, not to begin again, but simply to sit, his hands resting loosely in his lap, eyes on the drawer, as though it had told him a story, and perhaps it had, not one of adventure or drama, but of practice and presence, of how even the smallest pieces, the parts others overlook, can be shaped into a kind of peace. And the shop breathes with him as he sits in stillness, the moment stretched thin and soft as leather, warm with memory and quietly whole. The first sound is not loud, not a clap, not a downpour, not even the heavy hush that comes from a storm in full swing. It's the faintest percussion, a soft tapping like fingertips on a parchment, and the shoemaker, seated by the window with no work currently in hand, tilts his head slightly as he recognizes it for what it is, the start of rain, not the kind that catches you unaware and forces a rush for cover, but the kind that arrives politely, with time to listen and adjust and let yourself receive it. And so he rises, not with any haste, and walks to the workshop door, which creaks gently as it opens inward. And there he stands, hands tucked behind his back, looking out at the narrow cobbled street that now glistens under a fine sheen of water. Above, the clouds have thickened into a pale, drowsy gray, not dark with threat, but full and woolen, like a heavy blanket stretched across the sky. The rooftops across the way shimmer with slick tiles, their edges bleeding water in thin rivulets that trace patterns down the stone, and below, a puddle forms beside the worn wheel ruts, slowly expanding in lazy rings with every drop that lands. The shoemaker does not think to fetch a bucket, or close the shutters tighter, or move anything from the sill. He simply watches, breath slowing to match the rhythm of the weather, eyes softened by the lack of motion, the comfort of having nothing to do but stand there. And with every passing minute, the sound deepens. The tapping becomes a patter, the patter becomes a whisper, and the whisper grows until it fills the alleyway and the shop with its low, soothing murmur, a sound without language, without punctuation, one that neither builds nor fades, but simply is. And in that sound, the shoemaker lets his thoughts dissolve, not into sleep, but into suspension, like dust settling in still water. He is no longer thinking of shoes, or soles, or scraps, or stitches, no longer reviewing the day's work or the errands he did not run. He is just here, in the doorway, as rain falls, and in the distance the clang of a church bell rings, muffled and softened by the clouds, each tone dripping into the next, like wax melting into wax. He hears it without registering its number, without wondering which hour has arrived. For the first time that day, time is not a thing to be measured. And he notices now the scent of it too, that mineral-rich perfume of stone kissed by rain, the earthy breath of wet leather drifting faintly from the rack behind him, and a single whiff of rosemary from the pot growing crookedly in a jar by the step. It all mingles in the damp air, forming something unnameable but deeply familiar. And he shifts his weight once, not because he is uncomfortable, but because standing like this for too long makes the knees feel overly still. And when he leans slightly on the door frame, resting his shoulder against its worn edge, the wood gives a faint creak, joining the chorus of natural sounds that have now fully replaced the silence of the shop. And outside, a cat trots along the far wall of the alley, pausing under a ledge to shake its paws, eyes catching his just briefly before continuing without concern. And the puddles grow, and the gutters gurgle softly, and the air begins to cool, and still he stands, unmoving in purpose, but not in presence. For the rain, in all its ordinary beauty, has given him something no customer, no tool, no task ever truly offers, a moment that asks nothing in return. And when he finally steps back inside, gently closing the door with a low click, the sound of rain continues behind it, muffled now, but still part of him. And in the soft echo of it, the shoemaker returns to his stool, sits down, and simply listens, eyes half closed, mind quiet, hands resting in his lap, content not to make or mend, but merely to be, as the rain outside continues to whisper against the shutters and rooftops, soft and persistent like a lullaby, meant more for stones than for people. The workshop dims earlier than usual, not with the finality of dusk, but with the gradual hush of light slowly withdrawing, drawing long shadows that creep along the floor and blur the corners of the shelves. And the shoemaker, still seated quietly at his stool, notices not through alarm or impatience, but by the subtle way his hand, reaching for the awl, no longer casts a crisp outline against the bench. He blinks once, then looks toward the small candle, already burning by the window, its wick now low, flame steady, but too distant to light the surface where his fingers rest. And so he rises, slowly as always, feeling the gentle tightness in his knees, and steps across the room toward the cabinet near the back wall, where he keeps the extra candles tucked into a worn linen wrap, their shapes uneven, their ends often smoothed by handling and age. He unties the cloth with a practiced gesture and selects one without deliberation, not the tallest or the newest, just the one closest to his fingers. And as he holds it, he notices the tiny flecks of wax on the edge, reminders of earlier nights when it was lit and used, then pinched out before it could finish. And this, he thinks without thinking, is what it means to live simply, not in using things up quickly, but in returning to them slowly, allowing each item to carry the mark of time. And he sets the candle in the brass holder on the workbench, then leans forward to catch the flame from the first candle using a long matchstick, its end darkened from past use. The spark is small at first, reluctant, then blossoms into a gentle glow that brings warmth back to the bench. And for a moment, the two flames burn together across the room, as though exchanging some silent greeting before one bows out. He lets the match extinguish itself in the shell of a cracked bowl, then sits again, his hands now illuminated once more, the awl resting where he left it, beside the half-finished soul. And as the candlelight settles around him, he feels the soft calm of return, the quiet knowledge that even though the rain continues and the sky remains gray, the workshop has not darkened entirely, nor will it, for the candles will hold it gently in their glow, marking the hours not in chimes or bells, but in the slow retreat of wax, in the deepening pools around each base, in the faint scent of warm tallow curling into the air. And he picks up the soul, fingers cradling it, as he resumes the slow, rhythmic stitching, the thread pulling through the leather with a sound so faint it might be mistaken for breath. And outside, the city remains quiet under its blanket of rain. And inside, the only light is flame, and the only motion is that of hands working by instinct, not for progress, not for profit, but because in moments like this, doing is a kind of stillness, and stillness when lit by candlelight is its own kind of prayer. With the second candle burning low and the light outside the window now fully surrendered to the blue-gray veil of evening, the shoemaker feels the shift not in urgency or time, but in temperature, a soft chill beginning to settle into the floor beneath his feet, the kind that comes not from cold alone, but from the world slowing down, and without rush, without any particular cue, he sets his awl aside, lets the leather rest on the bench, and stands once more, not stiffly, not reluctantly, but with the practiced grace of someone who knows that tending to oneself is also part of the craft. He moves to the back corner of the workshop, where a small clay brazier sits beneath a low stone shelf, and atop it rests a soot-darkened kettle, humble in shape, slightly chipped at the rim, but dependable as ever. Beside it sits a jar of dried herbs, mostly rosemary and lemon balm, gathered in small bundles and tied with twine weeks ago, hung upside down to dry in the warmth near the window, then crumbled gently into the jar, once brittle. He opens it now, releasing a quiet bouquet of scent that rises like memory, sharp, green, a little earthy, with the faintest whisper of summer's heat. He smiles, barely, not out of delight, but out of recognition, for it is the same smell he's inhaled each evening for as many years as he can recall, and he measures out a small pinch, letting it fall into the base of a ceramic mug, then lifts the kettle, empty from the last use, and carries it to the pitcher near the door where the day's water was drawn. The pitcher is cool, slightly beaded with condensation, and he pours with care, watching the thin stream disappear into the kettle with a sound like a sigh. Then, returning to the brazier, he sets it gently over the glowing coals he stoked earlier, which now radiate a soft, persistent heat that needs no flame to make itself known. The kettle rests on them like a stone on a riverbed, still and steady, and he kneels beside it, not watching impatiently, but simply waiting, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his eyes unfocused, listening to the first signs of life, the low creak of metal expanding, the whisper of water beginning to stir. And around him, the room is quiet, save for the faint scratching of wind against the shutters and the occasional drip from the eaves. And in this hush, he is more present than he has been all day, not working, not fixing, not remembering, just here. And when the kettle begins to murmur, not boil, just murmur, like a throat preparing to speak, he lifts it carefully and pours the water into the mug, steam rising in soft coils that spiral and vanish as though the air itself were sighing in response, and the herbs bloom instantly, their scent deepening, softening, turning the space around the mug into a kind of invisible garden. And he carries it back to his bench, both hands wrapped around it, not out of fear of spilling, but because the warmth feels good against his fingers. And he sits once more, not to return to work, but to rest, not fully, not sleep, but a pause. And as he sips, the bitterness of the rosemary and the gentle citrus of the lemon balm meet his tongue with quiet certainty, grounding him in the now. And outside, the rain has thinned to a mist, and inside, the candle flickers quietly beside the mug, and for a long time he does not move, only sips, slowly, deliberately, as though the tea is not meant to refresh, but to remind him that the day is nearly done, and in its ending, nothing needs to be hurried. Not the tea, not the breath, not even the thoughts, only this: warmth, quiet, and the deep contentment of still being here. The tea has grown lukewarm in his hands. Though he does not mind, he still holds the cup gently, the ceramic smooth and slightly chalky under his fingers, and every so often he lifts it for a final sip, letting the herbal warmth spread across his tongue, not for taste, but for the memory of warmth, like the remnants of a fire that once burned steadily, and in the stillness of the workshop, where the candle now burns lower than before, its wax softened into a lazy golden pool around the base. A small flutter interrupts the air, not loud, not jarring, but present, like the brief rustle of a page being turned in a quiet library, and his eyes move toward it without surprise, already sensing what it is before he sees it. A single moth, pale and weightless, hovering just within the halo of the candle's glow, its wings trembling with invisible rhythms as it drifts in soft circles, and the shoemaker does not move, does not shoo it away, but merely watches as the delicate creature performs its slow ballet, not frantic or wild, but hesitant and gentle, as if the moth, too, understands the quiet of this room and seeks only to be near the warmth, not consumed by it. And around the candle's glow, the shadows dance in response, the faint outline of the moth flickering across the wall like a breath held too long, and he thinks, not aloud, but within, how many nights must pass like this, unnoticed, unremarkable, except by those who learn to look closely. How many moths have come and gone in this little workshop, each seeking light, each passing like a question, never asked. And he considers, with the slow drift of someone who has no urgency to arrive at any conclusion, that there is something sacred in this moment, in the presence of a creature so small and yet so devoted, so fragile and yet unafraid. And he remembers, faintly, as though from a life before this one, a time when he too reached for something just out of reach, something glowing, something quiet, perhaps a dream of more or less, or simply something different. And the moth continues to dance, dipping and rising, folding its wings before letting them fan out once again. And the candle flame, steady but gentle, does not flicker in protest, does not leap toward it or retreat. It simply burns, the way the shoemaker's days burn, slowly, with purpose, without spectacle. And he sets his cup down now, empty and warm, and leans slightly back, his shoulders resting against the wall behind his stool, eyes soft, not tired, but still. And the moth makes one final arc before settling on the table's edge, its wings folded into a quiet V, as if praying or sleeping, or simply waiting for nothing. And they sit together like that, the shoemaker and the moth, both suspended in the soft amber stillness of the candle's light, both held in the hush of a world that asks nothing more from them than simply to exist side by side in the gentle patience of night. And outside, the mist has lifted, and the stars, faint but persistent, return to their places in the sky, unnoticed, unneeded, but ever faithful, as the candle beside him dips lower still, now pooling softly around the base and casting a buttery glow along the edge of the bench. The shoemaker slowly rises, his body warm from sitting still, and casts his eyes upward toward the wooden shelf above the tools, a shelf that holds more than materials, more than thread or wax or leather scraps. It holds the record of his work, quiet and undisturbed, in the form of an old ledger, thick and slightly warped with age, its binding soft and frayed at the corners. And tonight, with no one waiting, no repairs pressing, and the moth, now still in the candlelight's edge, he reaches for it, gently brushing a faint layer of dust from the cover with his thumb as he draws it down and sets it on the table before him. He doesn't open it right away. Instead, he sits, both hands resting flat on the cover, feeling the texture of its worn leather surface, the quiet coolness of a book that has not been handled in some weeks. And then, slowly, he opens the first page, the hinges of the spine groaning softly, the paper inside yellowed but strong, lined with his careful handwriting, date after date, name after name, rows of letters and numbers that once held such purpose, but now feel like verses of a slow-moving poem. Madonna Eleonora, 2 pairs, spring, oxblood, repair requested in June. Giovanni D, wide heel support, autumn boot, arch seam split, returned same month. Luca, child of Maria, gifted sandals for feast day, no charge, and each line brings with it a subtle shift of memory, not sharp or vivid, but like the scent of something once familiar that drifts past unexpectedly. He sees the shapes of people as he reads, the outlines of days that feel so long ago they might as well belong to someone else. The children grown, the couples buried, the soldiers who marched away, and yet here they remain, etched in quiet ink, a line in a ledger that no longer means anything to the world, but still means something to him. He turns the pages slowly, some catching slightly where oil from his fingertips once pressed too firmly, others curling faintly at the corners, the result of humid summers and cold winters folded together. And in the margins, he sometimes finds notes, little remarks in smaller handwriting, tight across the toes, remedy with damp stretch, or left heel wears faster than right, habitual lean, and he wonders, briefly, what it means to have known someone so well by the shape of their step, the wear of their soul, the slope of their arch, to know them not through stories or conversation, but through their feet, the way they moved through the world. And though he never thought himself a keeper of lives, the ledger says otherwise, page after page showing the soft imprint of so many others, stitched into the thread of his quiet days. And he keeps turning, not to reach the end, but to stay within it, to dwell in the peaceful repetition of names and sizes and leather types, of seasons and sandals and repairs and returns, until he reaches a blank page, untouched, waiting. And for a long moment, he rests there, eyes on the empty lines, not to fill them, but to witness their stillness. And then, without writing, without marking the page, he closes the ledger and draws it gently to his chest, holding it with both arms crossed, not possessively, not sentimentally, but with reverence. And when he rises to return it to its place, he does so with slow, deliberate steps, lifting it again to the high shelf where it rests, as though placing a memory back in its drawer. And the candle still glows, the moth still sleeps, and the shoemaker returns to his seat, not to work, not to drink, not to speak, but simply to be, accompanied by the quiet knowledge that every step he's ever helped make has found its way into the gentle silence of the present. As the hour grows late and the air within the workshop grows cooler and denser, with the soft, calming scent of melted wax and herbal tea. The shoemaker knows it is not yet time to sleep, but it is time to begin the quiet winding down of the day. Oh, not a conclusion, but a tapering. And he turns his attention now toward the row of tools that sit patiently in the groove of his long wooden bench, each one shaped by years of use, darkened by oil and time, yet still entirely faithful to their purpose. And this part of the evening, though it holds no outward importance, has long been one of his most consistent rituals. The gathering, the wiping, the gentle arrangement of the implements he will reach for again in the morning, each one touched not to polish, but to acknowledge. And he begins with the knife, the curved blade with its thick handle, worn smooth by his grip, its edge dulled to a point just shy of dangerous, exactly as he prefers it. He lifts it, wipes it with a square of cloth folded just for this task, then places it into the groove again with the handle facing left, precisely where his hand expects it. Next comes the awl, its tip still dark, with thread wax, which he gently turns in a circle against the cloth, not to clean it, but to feel the pressure, the shape of it, reminding his fingers of the weight they know so well. He sets it down beside the knife, always 2 finger widths apart, a spacing no one else would notice, but which would feel wrong to him if misplaced. The hammer follows, its wooden shaft nicked and splintered in places, but the head still firm, the balance just right. He runs his hand down its length slowly, like one might stroke the bark of an old tree. Then the pliers, the edge trimmer, the bone folder, the stitch marker, each one receiving the same attention. Not elaborate, not ceremonial, but quietly intimate, as though he is not just arranging tools, but tending to old companions. And as he moves from one to the next, he doesn't rush, doesn't think of what still needs to be done, but allows himself to fully inhabit the task, his breath moving in time with his motions, slow and quiet. And once everything has been placed back into its proper place, he takes a moment to observe the line they form, imperfect, slightly crooked in parts, but deeply familiar. And in that crookedness, there is comfort, like a row of houses leaning into one another against the wind. And behind him, the candle continues to burn, now flickering lower as its wax thins to the rim, casting long, stretched shadows that make the tools seem taller, almost like figures resting in a quiet assembly. And he picks up the cloth again, folds it neatly, and sets it beneath the hammer, where it will wait for him again tomorrow. Then he dusts the bench lightly with his hand, not to remove anything, but as a gesture of closure, a soft sweeping that says, enough. And in that moment, surrounded by the tools of his trade, each resting, each known, each cared for, the shoemaker feels the gentle end of the day settle around him, not like a curtain drawn closed, but like a door quietly pulled to, and he remains still for a few long breaths, then lets out a slow exhale through his nose, not a sigh, but a release, the breath one makes when everything is exactly where it should be and nothing more is needed. And he leans back once more in his chair, now companion to silence, to tools, to night, and to himself, whole, unhurried, and deeply at rest. The moment arrives not with announcement or alarm, but as a subtle shift, a kind of drawing inward, a retreat of light so slow and natural that it feels more like breath being held than light being lost. The candle, his faithful companion through the long evening, now burns with a thin, wavering flame, flickering in quiet hesitation at the edge of its wick's life, and the shoemaker, seated once again at his bench, does not reach for another, nor move to replace it, for this moment has become its own kind of ending, a signal that the day, long and uneventful, in the way only peaceful days can be, is nearing its gentle close, and he sits motionless, his hands folded lightly in his lap, watching as the small tongue of flame dances, not wildly, but with the tremble of something that knows it is almost done. The wax has gathered at the base in a delicate rim, cooling unevenly, glinting faintly as it catches the candlelight from within, and the shadows it casts are long now, exaggerated and soft. The tools along the bench stretched into abstract outlines across the wall, swaying slightly each time the flame wavers, and there is no sound but the subtle creak of the old wood beneath him as he shifts his weight just slightly, careful not to disturb the quiet rhythm that the flickering flame has set. And in that dance of light and shadow, the shoemaker finds something familiar, not exactly memory, not quite reflection, but something in between. He thinks of nights just like this one, years past, when the flame faltered and he sat just so, watching it without needing to speak or act, when the stillness wasn't something to endure, but something to sink into. And he wonders, absently, how many candles he has watched to their end. How many days have been sealed shut with the final flicker of light, and though he could not name them, could not number them, he knows their weight, their shape, not in hours or events, but in the quiet pulse of repetition, work, light, rest, again and again, and the flame grows smaller now, curling inward, shrinking into itself like a leaf in winter, and then, with no fanfare, it gutters once, twice, and disappears. The wick blackens into a tiny coil, and the last puff of smoke lifts into the air like a final thought, and the room falls into shadow, not darkness entirely, for the window still holds the faintest trace of moonlight, enough to outline the edges of the bench, the glint of a tool's curve, the faint shine of polished leather, but within all is muted, softened, slowed, and he does not light another candle, does not rise to chase the darkness away. He remains seated, letting the absence of light fill the space like cool water, letting his eyes adjust, letting his breath move slowly in and out, as though the room itself breathes with him. And he feels the weight of the day, not as a burden, but as a quiet pressure in his limbs, a fullness, a closing, like the final stitch, drawn through the sole of a shoe, the knot tied, the thread snipped, and he places his hand lightly over the extinguished candle, not to feel heat, for it is gone, but to acknowledge its presence, to thank it without words. And then he leans back, letting his shoulders rest fully, his head tilted toward the ceiling beams now fading into shadow. And in that posture, in that silence, he allows the darkness to hold him, not as something to fear, but as something earned, the gentle reward of a day completed with care. And though sleep still waits beyond this room, for now he remains cradled by shadow, accompanied by memory, wrapped in the simple satisfaction of light that was and light that is no longer. For a long while, after the candle has given its last breath, the shoemaker sits in the quiet dark, his thoughts as slow and weightless as dust suspended in the still air. There is no pull to rise, no urgent signal from the world around him, and yet his body knows by the heaviness in his limbs, by the angle of his spine against the worn wood of the chair, by the soft hum of tired muscles cooling in the quiet, that it is time to move again, not to work, not to continue, but to end. And so, with a slow breath drawn through his nose and released in a patient, silent stream through his mouth, he presses both palms into the edges of the bench and rises, the motion slow and without effort, his knees creaking faintly as he straightens. He pauses halfway, allowing his back to adjust, then completes the movement and stands tall in the dark. And though he cannot see the corners of the room clearly, he does not need to. The space is so familiar to him, shaped not by design, but by memory, that even in darkness he could walk its dimensions without thought. He lifts both arms gently above his head, fingers threading together as he stretches upward, spine elongating with a soft pull, shoulders rolling in slow circles. And the stretch is not meant to correct posture or to limber muscles. It is simply the body's quiet response to stillness, a whisper of movement, like a plant leaning slightly toward moonlight. And speaking of moonlight, he notices it now, pale and clean and soft, sliding through the narrow window above the workbench, where the shutters have remained half ajar. It falls in a long rectangle across the floorboards, lighting a faint silver path that glows just enough to remind him that the world beyond the shop has not disappeared, only shifted, only softened, and he steps into that light with bare feet, the wood beneath them cool but welcoming, the grain familiar to his soles, and he lets his arms fall loosely to his sides again, breathing out slowly, his eyes adjusting to the gentle silver that outlines the edges of his tools, the curve of the bench, the small drawer chest near the cot where he sleeps, and with slow, deliberate steps he begins to tidy what little remains undone. He folds the cloth left draped across the corner of the bench and sets it atop the rack with the same care one might offer a prayer shawl. He adjusts the position of the stool just slightly so it sits flush with the table's edge. He moves the tea mug to the far side of the shelf, near the water pitcher, turning the handle outward, not because anyone will see, but because it feels right, and only when the last of these motions is complete, tiny, quiet gestures of closure, does he turn toward the cot tucked into the alcove beside the far wall, half shrouded in the velvet dark. And though his steps are measured, they are also relaxed, like a long exhale drawn out in motion. And in this way, the room, once filled with light and motion, now becomes again a place of silence, not the silence of absence, but the silence of completion, the kind of stillness earned only through the long, unspoken rhythms of a day, done simply and fully. And as he reaches the edge of the cot, he rests one hand on its post, feeling the smoothness worn into it by countless nights, just like this one, and he does not speak, does not think, does not plan. He only breathes and lets the last of his waking tension settle into the floor behind him. With one final glance across the room, not to inspect, not to check, but simply to acknowledge, the shoemaker lowers himself onto the edge of the cot, the wooden frame creaking softly in response, not with protest, but with recognition, as though it too has been waiting for this moment of rest. He moves slowly, not out of weariness alone, but out of habit, his motions measured and unhurried, the way one handles something sacred. And as he swings his legs up and lets his back sink into the thin mattress, familiar to every curve of his body, there is no sound but the soft rasp of linen against fabric, the quiet exhale of his breath joining the silence around him. The blanket, rough woven and folded neatly at the foot of the cot, is drawn up with one steady pull and settled lightly over his frame, reaching just below the chin, its weight slight but sufficient, like the comforting pressure of a hand on the shoulder. And beneath it, he lies still, not shifting or fidgeting, simply adjusting his limbs into the shape they know best, the position long practiced over countless nights, one arm resting across his midsection, the other curled gently under the small pillow beneath. His head and his eyes, though they remain open for a while longer, do not search or roam, but settle softly on the ceiling beams just barely visible in the darkness. And it is here, in this narrow cot, in this quiet corner of the room, he knows better than the lines on his own palm, that he allows his mind to truly empty, not by effort, not through intention, but by release, a gentle falling away of thoughts, like tools returned to their place, like threads unwinding, the lists of repairs, the weight of the day, the faint scent of wax and leather, all still present, but hushed, like voices lowering out of respect. And though he does not seek dreams, he does not resist them either. He lets them gather slowly at the edges, like morning mist creeping across stone. And in the stillness of the room, where the last hint of moonlight rests softly on the floor, casting no shadow, now but a gentle sheen, he blinks once, twice, then closes his eyes, not tightly, not deliberately, just enough to signal that he no longer needs to see. And outside, the streets of Florence remain hushed, save for the occasional clop of a horse's hooves far in the distance, or the hush of wind between tiles. And within the workshop, no candle burns, no tool stirs, no breath is wasted, only the slow, steady rhythm of a man whose work has ceased, whose thoughts have settled, whose day has folded in on itself like a finished shoe, placed gently on the shelf. And though no one sees, no one marks the moment, it matters. For in the quiet settling of his body against the cot, in the faint lift and fall of his chest, the room becomes whole again, not because anything has changed, but because, at last, all has become still, and that stillness, deep and even, wraps him like the blanket itself, carrying him gently toward the first quiet moments of sleep. Time has become unmeasured now, stretched thin like gold leaf across the edge of consciousness. And though the shoemaker does not sleep yet, he no longer quite wakes either. He floats in that in-between place where the world has dimmed to, a murmur, and the body, though still, hums with the soft echo of life's rhythm. His breath, slow and even, moves in and out through parted lips, brushing past the faint shadow of his mustache, the exhale quieter than the whisper of silk across a tabletop. Each inhale draws in cool air that smells faintly of old wood and faint herbs, and each exhale lets go of the day in pieces so small they cannot be named. And though his body lies curled on the cot, blanketed and unmoving, his mind drifts gently outward, not toward specific memories, but toward the spaces between them. He sees no faces, hears no words, but feels the residue of countless moments, the shape of a child's shoe in his palm, the warm weight of a finished pear returned to its owner, the hush of leather being cut cleanly in the morning light. They come not as stories, but as impressions, ripples in still water, and over them all lies the soft hush of Florence at night, a city at rest, the stone walls of neighboring buildings exhaling the warmth of the sun absorbed during the day, the rooftops silent beneath the stars, the distant splash of a fountain echoing faintly in the alleys, the rustle of fabric behind closed shutters where other families settle into sleep, and within his little room, tucked between old walls and quiet time, the shoemaker feels the weight of the world slip further from his shoulders, not discarded, not forgotten, but folded carefully like a cloak placed at the foot of the bed. And beneath that weightlessness, he becomes acutely aware of smaller things, the pulse behind his ear, the press of linen beneath his cheek, the way the blanket settles heavier on his legs than on his chest, and somewhere deep within, his thoughts, once so steady and precise, begin to lose their edges, dissolving into shapes and textures, into the rhythm of a stitch drawn through soft hide, into the shimmer of a sunlit puddle in the workshop doorway. And though he might be able to summon a clear image if he tried, he does not try, for in this space between waking and sleep, he understands that effort is no longer needed. All that remains is release. And as his breath deepens into that familiar cadence that the body recognizes as sleep's prelude, his jaw slackens slightly, his hands unclench, and the gentle crease in his brow smooths into calm, and with one final slow breath, he lets himself sink, not downward, not inward, but outward into the still, formless quiet where nothing must be made, nothing must be mended, and nothing must be remembered, only felt, only allowed. And in that feeling, he begins to sleep, and now the room holds stillness so deep it becomes its own kind of presence, not simply an absence of sound or motion, but a fullness of quiet that wraps around every beam, every tool, every folded scrap of leather, as though the very air has gone soft in reverence for the moment. The shoemaker, lying still beneath his coarse blanket, has surrendered fully to sleep, not the restless, shifting kind, but the heavy, root-deep sleep of someone who has given everything the day asked of him and nothing more. His breath is inaudible now, so slow and steady that even the moth, resting in the shadows, might not detect its rhythm. The moonlight that once carved silver shapes across the floor has thinned, retreating toward the windowsill as the stars slowly shift their places overhead, and the faintest cool draft rolls through the narrow cracks between shutter slats. But the shoemaker does not stir, for the rhythms of the night have become distant, like waves brushing some far-off shore, and all that matters lies here, within these old walls, in the fading warmth of a long-lived day. The cot creaks once, as the linen settles beneath his weight, but even that sound feels hushed, absorbed into the stillness that has blanketed the room like a second layer of sleep. The tools on the bench, the knife, and awl and hammer, rest untouched, their edges dulled by night, their outlines softened by shadow, as if even they must sleep before being summoned once again by morning. And high above, the beams that stretch across the ceiling, heavy with age and dust, and the memory of storms, bear silent witness to the shoemaker's dreams. Dreams that leave no trace, no movement, no whispered words, only the slight turning of his shoulder against the mattress, the way a leaf might shift in the windless air. And in this silence, time folds inward, the distinction between past and present, between what was made and what might be mended tomorrow, melts into the hush, and Florence, that ever-breathing city, holds its breath alongside him. No bells ring, no hooves clatter, no voices call, just the occasional rustle of unseen ivy brushing the outer wall, and the steady slumber of a man who has lived another day, not with greatness, not with spectacle, but with quiet care. And that care has left behind no monument, no legacy carved in marble, only a tidy workshop, a finished pair of shoes, and the gentle imprint of a life made whole through patient hands and unspoken discipline. And now, that life pauses, not ended, not measured, but held, perfectly still, like the space between footsteps, or the breath between sentences. And as the night reaches its quietest point, and the stars blink more faintly behind gathering clouds, the workshop remains exactly as it should be, quiet, warm, complete, holding one sleeping man, a bench of resting tools, and a silence so deep it feels like peace itself.